and repeats its objection on the adverse impacts of light pollution on residential amenity, and does not consider that these can be adequately mitigated, especially during nighttime backlot filming. Appendix A of Councillor Crabtree's proof contains photos from other nearby Bray and Pinewood studios, which clearly demonstrate the extent of the glare that would be experienced by local residents during backlot filming. Turning then to the Ecology Roundtable. In her proof of evidence, Councillor Crabtree notes that Buckinghamshire Bird Club record that plots 1 to 5 support over 70 species of breeding birds. Councillor Crabtree's proof highlights her concerns about the adverse impact of noise and light generated from the appeal proposals on local wildlife. These concerns were echoed and amplified by Mrs. West, Mrs. Foote and Mr. Seekins during the Ecology Roundtable session. The Rule 6 party endorses their comments, particularly those of Mrs. West, which highlight the importance of recognising the interconnectedness of habitats between Spade Oak Lake and Roach Lake, the appeal site and the wider country park. The Rule 6 party also endorses Mrs. West's remarks that any backlot management plan would need to include sufficiently detailed provisions for managing and mitigating the impact of backlot filming and set construction or deconstruction on the species that live and breed in that area. Turning then to traffic congestion and parking overspill. The Rule 6 party adopts the Council's position that development is not suitably accessible to non-car modes of travel and detrimental to highway safety and convenience. The inquiry heard further evidence on these matters from Councillor Crabtree in relation to the appeal site and its surroundings, and from Mrs. Cook, who recounted her experience of living near Pinewood. And whilst recognising, of course, that the Rule 6 party did not produce technical highways evidence or cross-examine Mr. Diggs, it must be recalled that Councillor Crabtree and Councillor Mrs. Cook's evidence was tested under cross-examination. And so, ma'am, you are entitled to consider their evidence on highways matters as you would of any interested party commenting on these issues. So then, wrapping up residential amenity, the appeal scheme would result in a severe cumulative impact on residential amenity from loss of greenbelt land and land allocated for recreational use under policy RUR 4, noise and light pollution, the overbearing visual impact of the appeal scheme, traffic congestion and parking overspill. It is neither accurate nor fair for Mr. Mann to characterise the Rule 6 party's position as a zero tolerance approach to any impact on the residents of Westhorpe Park Home. This is not an ordinary appeal scheme, and these are not ordinary residents, but a particularly vulnerable local community with the misfortune to live just metres away from a development proposal that would severely reduce their quality of life. Given the particular vulnerability of those residents, because of the fabric of their homes and the fact that some are elderly and suffering from mobility and other health conditions, Mr. Sensicle's omission of harm to residential amenity from the planning balance is unjustified. Mr. Sensicle attempts to defend this position by pointing out that the amenity of the nearest neighbours will change. This is almost always true when planning permission is granted, but he goes on to say this change will not lead to an unacceptable material impact on residents' amenity. However, this "you can't make an omelette without cracking eggs" approach is extremely simplistic. It just does not work in the context of this appeal proposal and the residents who would be impacted by it. The appellant's proposal to residential amenity demonstrates a serious lack of sensitivity in regard for the particular vulnerability of those residents to the appeal scheme. So the Rule 6 party's position is that the appeal scheme would result in substantial adverse impacts to residential amenity, and we invite you, ma'am, to include those harms in the planning balance and to give them substantial weight. Turning then to the question of need. In my opening statement, I said on behalf of the Rule 6 party that the appellant's need case was nebulous, speculative, and full of wishful thinking. And I promised we would demonstrate that the UK already has more than enough film studios to meet current and projected demand for years to come. And having now fully interrogated the appellant's need case during a week of oral evidence, there can be no doubt that we were correct and have done what we promised to do in opening. Behind the many hundreds of pages of evidence produced by 5 witnesses lay a distinct lack of methodological rigour, inconsistency, unproven speculation, and unconvincing attempts to portray a market that is divorced from the reality of what the evidence actually demonstrates. And I set out the 4 arguments put forward there by the appellant's need witnesses. And then this section of the closing statement will look at those in turn, ma'am, and demonstrate why the appellant, we say, has failed to make out its case on those points. So the first proposition from the appellant's need witnesses is the UK screen industry's position in a global context supports the appellant's need case. So in response to questions by Mr. Bird KC, Mrs. Neville acknowledged that the British Film Institute had not forecast any deficiencies in studio space, and as Mrs. Neville also acknowledged, nor had the British Film Commission. Having been taken to a comment by Adrian Wotton of the BFC to the parliamentary inquiry, where he stated, we're not now in a process of trying to stimulate any new studio development in particular, above and beyond what has already been announced, because we want to see how that stage space matches the demand as it comes through. Mrs. Neville agreed that this comment demonstrates that the BFC has been keen to see how the additional stage space beds in respect of demand. Indeed, Mr. Wotton could not have been clearer in his position that lack of stage space is categorically not an issue for the UK film and TV industry. And I quote from Mr. Wotton's comments to the parliamentary inquiry in that regard. When I discussed with Mrs. Neville where Marlowe Film Studios would sit in the global market for high-end HGTV and film productions, she confirmed that the target market is the English language segment of the international market. Mrs. Neville pointed out that even if the UK theoretically had, as she said, all the space in the world to accommodate a never-ending stream of business, not all of it would come to the UK because, as she pointed out, a huge part of it is already going to stay domestically in America, and there are other competing territories. Mrs. Neville then went on to comment that the size of that global market is a demonstration of what we could gain. The extent of the global market that the UK could gain in addition to the market it is already successfully serving and can continue to service with existing and pipeline space is a crucial issue for this inquiry. Demonstration of an additional need for Grade A studio space, and particularly Marlowe Film Studios, depends on the answer to this question, as does the question, of course, of the economic benefits that would accrue from the appeal scheme. Mrs. Neville clearly has extensive experience from her role at the BFI, her former role there, and she confirmed to the inquiry that this involved discussing the needs of the international industry with people interested in filming in the UK and strategically identifying potential target markets for the UK. She acknowledged that part of that exercise involved an evaluation of how much studio space would be required by people interested in shooting in the UK. As such, Mrs. Neville readily admitted that UMAM would need to have a grasp on the specific market segment that Marlowe Film Studios is hoping to attract, what that looks like in production expenditure, and how much studio space would be required to accommodate it. Mrs. Neville also agreed that any investor considering investing in a studio development in the UK will primarily, of course, be driven by whether they will get a return on their investment and whether there is additional business that could come to the UK because of that investment that cannot currently be catered for. Mrs. Neville readily agreed that an investor would not take the risk without that level of certainty. And when asked about the meaning of her comment during Chief, that Marlowe Film Studios would appeal to people who are looking for a studio that is, as she put it, nice to be in, Mrs. Neville agreed that displacing people from studios that may be less nice to be in is not something that supports an assertion of unmet need for additional studio space. Put differently, displacing productions from studios that might be less nice to be in does not create additional business for the UK or additional jobs in the sector. All it does is displace business that is already being catered for in the UK from one studio to another. So in conclusion then on Mrs. Neville's evidence, nothing Mrs. Neville produced in her written or oral evidence indicated a quantitative or qualitative need in the UK for additional Grade A quality studio space. Neither the BFI nor the BFC highlighted any such need. Instead, Mr. Wootton of the BFC's evidence to the parliamentary inquiry pointed in quite the opposite direction. This is problematic for the appellant, given the crucial difference between something that would be a nice add-on in a speculatively perfect world and a pressing and demonstrable need case for an unmet need. Unfortunately then for the appellant, its need case falls squarely within the former bracket. We entirely agree with Mrs. Neville that UMAM will need to know, in as precise terms as possible, the share of the international English-speaking market that the UK could potentially capture if it had additional Grade A space, and how much additional Grade A space will be required for it to do so. As will be discussed in the next section of this closing speech, Mr. Chordovich's evidence reveals that the appellant has not provided the inquiry with any evidence on this matter. As Mrs. Neville agreed, based on her experience of dealing with industry figures, such evidence is important to potential investors and to UMAM in your consideration of the need for Marlow Film Studios. So the second proposition of the appellant's need case is the global addressable market for film and TV content production remains robust, with the UK standing to attract even higher levels of production spending if it can offer sufficient studio space. Mr. Chordovich's evidence to the inquiry focused on the economic need for additional film and studio facilities in the UK, specifically for Marlow Film Studios, and a segment of the international market that the UK is currently unable to serve due to lack of space. Firstly, we discussed the elements of the market that Mr. Chordovich claimed were driving growth across the global film and TV market. In other words, the OTT video market, which, as he pointed out in chief, is the most important to assessing growth at this inquiry. In particular, production expenditure on original film and TV content is the main element generating demand for studio space. To illustrate this point, Mr. Chordovich relied on Ampere analysis, demonstrating the estimated global spend on the production or acquisition of audiovisual content in 24. However, Ampere documentation, submitted alongside Mr. Kershaw's evidence, provided a more nuanced and analytical view of trends in the global OTT market. What that report and the accompanying graph from July 24 demonstrated was decline or stagnation in production spend from all of the main platforms except for Netflix and Amazon, whose production spend increased sharply in Q1 24. Mr. Chordovich had not produced any evidence of his own for this inquiry on quarter-to-quarter commissioning patterns to contradict the decline in production spending documented in Ampere's report. As will be discussed in further detail later in this closing speech, all that Mr. Chordovich has to rely on for his optimistic growth predictions are unproven, long-term forecasts based on hopeful speculation. None of the recent statistics on decline in production spending on original film and TV content in the OTT market support Mr. Chordovich's case for tremendous and ongoing growth driving demand for additional UK studio space. Instead, the only two platforms experiencing demonstrable growth in production spend, Netflix and Amazon, have ample UK studio space now and for the foreseeable future. And I set out a quote there that I won't read in full from Mr. Benjamin King of Netflix that he made to the parliamentary inquiry on this point. Furthermore, the top spenders on Ampere's graph are already catered for in terms of studio space. Netflix and Amazon have MLAs at Shepperton for at least another 10 years. Amazon has its own studios in Bray, and Disney, which started to turn a profit just last year in 24, has an MLA with Pinewood until 29. So there is no evidence before this inquiry suggesting that production companies not currently tied into MLAs are struggling to find space. And see, for example, the quote I've set out there from Mitchell Simmons of Paramount and his comments to the parliamentary inquiry about them always finding somewhere to produce in the UK. Mr. Georgevich's reliance on the OTT industry to support the appellant's need case is further undermined by current market trends. As explored in cross-examination, his Table 7 demonstrates that in the case of Disney, Comcast and Amazon, spend on acquired content for which studio space is not required, outpaced spending on original productions. There was marginally more spend on original content at Netflix and quite a bit more on original spend than acquired content in the cases of Paramount and Warner Brothers. As pointed out in Mr. Kershaw's evidence, the increase in focus on acquired content reflects market consolidation as streamers prioritise profitability over growth and make a strategic push to achieve economies of scale and reduce market competition. Streamers are increasingly focused on strengthening their market positions through focus on non-English language speaking markets and the acquisition of sports rights. Neither of these growing trends were disputed by Mr. Georgevich in cross-examination. Put simply, none of these trends support Mr. Georgevich's assessment of the need for UK studio space. Mr. Georgevich attempted to get around this unhelpful fact for the appellant by arguing in cross-examination that although platforms are focusing more and more on the unscripted genres and sports, this is to strengthen their financial position and give them confidence to invest in original content. But notably, Mr. Georgevich did not produce any evidence for this inquiry supporting his speculative assessment of how the market is evolving and why it's doing so in that way. We then moved on to questions of the total addressable market, TAM, or serviceable addressable market, SAM. The key difference between these markets is clear from Mr. Kershaw's rebuttal proof, where he defines those markets, just to recall, the TAM being the overall market opportunity, whilst the SAM being the portion of the TAM that a company can realistically target and serve. And of course, the SAM for UK studios is that English language scripted content. So there is a key difference. This is a key difference because it is the SAM, of course, that interests this inquiry, the segment of that global high-end English language speaking market that Marlowe Film Studios can realistically target and serve. Mr. Georgevich confirmed that the extent of the market segmentation that he had done was to estimate £55 billion in production spend for the global film and HGTV market, a market that, as he acknowledged in cross-examination, encompasses all genres, all languages, and all budget levels. In other words, Mr. Georgevich's evidence is focused on the TAM when it is the SAM that interests the inquiry. Most of the production expenditure comprised in that 55 billion figure is completely irrelevant and unobtainable in any event for Marlowe Film Studios. Mr. Georgevich agreed that there are segments within that 55 billion that the UK would be more competitive at attaining, the English language production, but admitted that he had not quantified them. He acknowledged the importance, however, of considering the SAM, but made no attempt at quantifying it for this inquiry. And we say this is a fatal methodological flaw in the appellant's need evidence that taints their whole approach on this question. The failure to quantify the SAM for Marlow Film Studios underscores the speculative and unproven nature of the appellant's need case. They are commending a case for urgent unmet need to this inquiry, with no quantification of what that represents in terms of additional production spend and studio space. It follows that there is no justification for their claims that they require approximately 168,718 square metres in the Green Belt and in an area allocated for recreational use under policy RUR4. Mr. Chordovich's argument that the serviceable market for Marlow is approximately under 1% of the 55 billion annual spend on film and TV production is no answer. All that tells us is what, in a perfect world, Marlow could theoretically cater for with its square metres. However, this build it and they will come approach is just a capacity point. It fails to consider where there is actually a need for that additional capacity. Just because you build a studio that could cater for under 1% of global production spend doesn't mean you necessarily will, particularly given the current market circumstances. In terms of market forecasts then, Mr. Chordovich forecast global growth in film and television production spending at 2 to 4%. Mr. Kershaw agrees with and adopts this approach himself in his calculations. This forecast for growth allows us to calculate how much studio space would be required in the UK to serve a greater share of US expenditure and accommodate overall growth trends in the market. However, it is noticeable and indicative of the appellant's flawed approach that, as conceded by Mr. Chordovich, 2 to 4% growth is anticipated across the entirety of the global market, all genres, languages, and budgets. Again, that 2 to 4% represents the TAM, not the SAM. In his rebuttal proof, Mr. Kershaw aligned himself with only a very slight divergence with Knight Frank's estimate that every £1 million of production spend requires 850 square feet of production space. And you can cross-reference those figures in footnote 33. To produce a forecast for required studio stage space using the 2 to 4% global growth estimate, it was necessary to define a baseline of production spend in 2024. In his rebuttal proof, Mr. Kershaw aligned himself with the appellant's range and, taking the average of the appellant's estimates, which are set out there, he arrived at 6.5 billion. These figures produced a forecast of demand for UK studio space, demonstrating that, based on current and pipeline supply of studio space, existing space will comfortably support Mr. Chordovich's higher growth forecast for years to come. Therefore, even on the appellant's own figures and their own methodology, there is no pressing need for additional studio space. And this conclusion has only been reinforced by the new BFI figures. Whilst the updated figures demonstrate that feature film expenditure has not grown in real terms, but returned to historic levels, HGTV expenditure has continued to decline from the high seen in the peak TV period of 2020 to 22. Not only does this reinforce the point that streamers' business models have evolved, but it also raises considerable doubts about Marlow's ability to increase the UK's share of feature film blockbusters. Based on these more recent figures then, it is reasonable to anticipate that HGTV spending will now grow at a more modest rate and from a lower base. We endorse Mr. Fannon's note on the new BFI statistics and his observations that the BFI's report of 5.6 billion spend comes in significantly lower than Knight Frank's baseline figure for production spend. The fact that we now start from a lower baseline of 5.6 billion has an obvious and significant knock-on effect, for Knight Frank and Mr. Chordovich's growth estimates. As pointed out by Mr. Fannon at paragraph 10 of his note, Taking Knight Frank's approach and projecting future demand from the lower baseline shows that the UK has more than sufficient existing studios capacity to accommodate growth beyond 2029. In any event, Mr. Chordovich's estimate that 24 expenditure is likely to be 6.6 billion due to delays in BFI reporting is closely aligned with the 6.5 billion figure used in Mr. Kershaw's forecast model, which demonstrates that the UK has sufficient existing studio capacity to accommodate growth. Mr. Chordovich argues in response in his note that a simple quantitative comparison of total stage supply and demand would fail to take into account the importance of the quality of stage supply in both accommodating ongoing demand and stimulating additional demand and enabling gains in global market share. However, the appellant's intention to build a beautiful studio building in Marlow cannot and will not change market dynamics. As was fairly and correctly conceded by Mrs. Neville, creating a building that is nice to be in merely creates displacement from other buildings that are less nice to be in. It does not add anything, and it certainly cannot alter global market dynamics. For the appellant to suggest otherwise is frankly magical thinking, faced with the reality of the market dynamics.
I'm getting a bit of background noise from somebody. So I'm just ensure all mics are turned off, please. Thank you. Continue, Ms. Neville.
Thank you. The BFI's updated 2024 figures clearly do not show a return to incredibly strong growth. Growth for 23-24 was always expected as the market catches up from the impact of the strikes. A more useful and reliable indication of the market can be gleaned from comparing 2024 with pre-strike years. This exercise clearly demonstrates that growth is nowhere near the levels seen during the streaming boom. In other words, HGTV expenditure has continued to decline from the highs of the peak TV period. At its core, Mr. Chordovich's note merely repeats his aspirations and expectations for the UK gaining additional market share that has already been demonstrated in this TAM and SAM debate to merely amount to wishful speculation. So turning then to the next proposition, that the continuing success of the UK's high-budget film and HGTV industry is dependent on new build Grade A studios, such as the appeal proposal being located in the West London cluster. The speculative and unproven nature of the appellant's need case was further demonstrated by Mr. Davis's evidence, the highlights of which include: firstly, agreement with Mr. Bird KC in cross-examination that Grade B studios are not unviable or incapable of offering good quality space fit for 21st century productions. This is of course illustrated by Netflix use of Grade B studio Longcross. Then agreement with Mr. Bird KC that the West London cluster has expanded over time as studios have developed. Next, acknowledgement that in 2024, the new purpose-built Grade A studio at Shinfield was not operating at full capacity. Now, this clearly demonstrates that space is available to accommodate the needs of production companies in search of Grade A space. If the appellant's depiction of a pressurised, undersupplied market were true, Shinfield would be operating at full capacity and turning people away. The fact that it is not tells us a lot about the current state of the market. It also demonstrates that new Grade A studios do not automatically generate demand in a market where there are many other factors at play. Then there was recognition from Mr. Davis that some MLAs allowed for subletting. It follows that studios such as Pinewood or Shepperton are not automatically closed to production companies not tied into an MLA. There was a concession during cross-examination with myself that his claim that the majority of potential crew live in and around the WLC is not backed up by any ONS data. Then there was agreement that BEC2 only compensates for lengthy travel between the production base, the studio, and other locations, For example, if you're going on location filming, but not between a person's home and their production base. And we had agreement that people with significant knowledge and experience in the industry have been content to invest in Grade A studios not located in the West London cluster. Shadowbox for Shinfield in Reading, MBS and Hackman Capital being the world's largest studio management company, for Eastbrook and Dagenham. It follows that location in the WLC is clearly not a deal breaker for experienced industry insiders. And Mr. Davis observed in chief that people who have experience in the industry are better placed to succeed than financial investors. However, when we went on then to compare in cross-examination the people and companies behind Shinfield and Eastbrook with Marlowe Film Studios, the only person with any link to the film industry among the directors of Dido Property Limited, the appellant, that Mr. Davis could point to is Mr. Laycock. However, Mr. Davis was not aware of Mr. Laycock having any experience of actually running a film studio. In terms of the other directors behind Dido Property, we established that Mr. Barrowcliff is a consultant for the Global Commercial Real Estate Service, CBRE, and nor does Lord Camoys have any experience of operating a film studio. This is an interesting observation in the light of Mr. Davis's emphasis in chief of the importance of the distinction between, and I quote, people who are in the film industry or financial investors looking to turn the land. So on the appellant's own evidence, the very people who are supposedly important to the successful establishment and operation of a film studio are nowhere to be seen in respect of this appeal proposal. We then discussed the recent developments at Pinewood Studios, who are considering development options for the site, including the eventual construction of a data centre, because, as was quoted in the press release on that, the reduction in global content production, combined with rising construction costs and business rates, triggered a review of our existing planning consent, and we believe the revised proposals provide a credible alternative. And this aligns with Andrew Smith's for Pinewood's comment to the parliamentary inquiry that they will be taking a very cautious approach to development because they wanted to see where the demand was going. It is notable that Pinewood, which has the backing of Airmont Capital, houses productions by top industry players such as Disney, Amazon and Netflix, and as a renowned studio of some decades, is indisputably run and operated by industry insiders. The only logical conclusion that can be drawn from Pinewood's decision to reconsider its development options for the site instead of building out its permitted expansion is that the current and projected supply meets the demand for studio space. If the appellant's need case were true, a studio of Pinewood's calibre would surely not hesitate to capitalise on the considerable opportunities canvassed by the appellant at this inquiry. Indeed, Mr. Davis did not hesitate to agree in cross that those at Pinewood are well informed of the short and long-term prospects of the market. So in addition to Pinewood's recent decision on the future direction of their previous plans for expansion, Sunset Studio, which is backed by the world's largest alternative asset manager, Blackstone, has also paused construction. Now, any observer, any investor observing the current trends at studios backed by reputable and informed actors would naturally hesitate to invest in a new studio. It is therefore notable, we say, and well, unsurprising, that the only concrete evidence that this inquiry has of any potential investor interest in Marlowe is a letter that by the company that Mr. Barrowcliff consults for, CBRE, that merely records CBRE's, and I quote, understanding that initial interest has been shown by international investors and that they were informed by Dido that a number of approaches have already been made to them from known global capital sources. There is no evidence of those approaches at this inquiry. All we have to go on is CBRE's understanding, based on second-hand information from Dido, that approaches have been made. In Mr. Davis's evidence, we had countless vague references to information that he was apparently not at liberty to disclose or reveal the sources for during cross-examination by Mr. Bird KC and I say this is ironic given the heavy criticism meted out by Mr. White KC for Mr. Kershaw's inability, having signed an NDA, to disclose the source of a few discrete matters. For the sake of consistency, if Mr. White KC argues that Mr. Kershaw's evidence should be discarded on that basis, well, it follows that Mr. Davis's evidence should also be cast aside. We're not advocating either approach, ma'am, and Mr. Kershaw's evidence should clearly be given full weight. As with the appellant's other need witnesses, nothing in Mr. Davis's evidence points to a credible and evidence-based conclusion of quantitative and/or qualitative deficiencies in existing studio supply. Furthermore, contrary to Mr. Davis's heavy reliance on location in the WLC, the evidence before this inquiry clearly demonstrates that location in the WLC is not make or break for the Grade A studio market. And then the last proposition by the appellant's need witnesses was that current studio capacity is not enough to reach the current and projected demands of the UK film industry due to a lack of quality custom-built Grade A studios. And on this matter, we endorse the points put to Ms. Waite in cross-examination by Mr. Bird KC. Given Mr. Davis's observations, and I quote the reference for that any studio currently operating at 60 to 65% capacity is, as he said, doing well, and the availability of space at the new Grade A Shinfield studios, it is difficult to ascertain how any production currently looking to shoot in the UK would struggle to find space. As Mr. Bird KC's cross-examination of Ms. Waite also highlighted, it also highlighted the extent to which crew shortages, as opposed to lack of space, is a significant constraint facing production companies. So turning then to economic benefits. The appellant's ability to prove its case on the economic benefits that would accrue from the appeal scheme is entirely contingent on its need case. The appellant's failure to make out its unsubstantiated and speculative need case for reasons just set out renders it impossible to have any confidence in its ability to deliver its proposed economic benefits. Put simply, a studio for which there is no need will not operate at the capacity required to generate the number of jobs suggested by the appellant, nor will it generate the GVA suggested by the appellant. Mrs. Evans' economic benefits evidence was filled with methodological flaws that led her to cross out the pages of her evidence on Method 2. Remarkably, it took 2 rounds of cross-examination and dogged insistence that you must be told in no uncertain terms the weight that you were being asked to give to Method 2 before Mrs. Evans finally conceded that this part of her proof should be disregarded entirely. Now, this is not the approach that one would expect of a reliable witness attempting to help an inquiry. It seriously undermines, we say, the credibility of the appellant's evidence on these issues and warrants you, ma'am, attaching limited weight to Mrs. Evans' evidence. Before going any further, I do pause to note that it is interesting that on several occasions, Mrs. Evans endorsed points made by Mr. Kershaw. And I say this is interesting, given Mr. White KC's stated intention to make submissions inviting you to attach no weight to Mr. Kershaw's evidence. Instead, notwithstanding Mr. White KC's numerous objections to Mr. Kershaw's qualifications, and I set out some of the questions there that were posed to Mr. Kershaw in footnote 46, and I posed the same ones back to Mr. Tordovich to illustrate the point that these are just irrelevant for this inquiry. So notwithstanding those objections and the great deal of time spent in cross-examination attacking the man rather than the content, Mr. Kershaw's evidence to the inquiry is clearly coherent, evidence-based, and should be given full weight. The inquiry was expected to wait patiently until Mrs. Evans' oral evidence for an explanation of why she changed the estimate of the minimum gross direct FTEs that would be created from the original figure of 1,780 submitted with the application in 22 to her new minimum estimate of 2,060 gross direct FTEs. And as set out in Mr. Kershaw's rebuttal, this is a 16% variation on the original minimum figures. And for reasons that are difficult to comprehend, Mrs. Evans did not feel the need to explain this variation in her proof. And following the Rule 6 party raising these unexplained discrepancies in rebuttal, the appellant's advocate accused Councillor Crabtree during cross-examination of having misunderstood Mrs. Evans' evidence. But no indication was given to the inquiry about what this alleged misunderstanding consisted of. Instead, rather unfairly and unhelpfully, we had to wait almost 2 weeks until Mrs. Evans was giving oral evidence to discover that Councillor Crabtree had not in fact misunderstood the evidence at all and wasn't apparently being accused of having done so. Instead, Mrs. Evans, having considered the matter further herself, was now commending her lower figure of 2,060 to you, ma'am. These discrepancies and the appellant's failure to simply be straightforward and upfront about any errors, clarifications or corrections raises serious doubts about the reliability of the appellant's economic analysis. So in respect of method 1, which just to recall is the floor space density method for calculating the additional employment that will be generated by Marlow Film Studios, the unreliability of the appellant's economic analysis is further compounded by Mrs. Evans' reliance on outdated reports from other film studios that are divorced from the reality of present-day market dynamics. In any event, as Mrs. Evans acknowledged, the floor space merely sets a limit to the number of employees. It does not determine it. Mrs. Evans derived her soundstage employment density figure of 64 from the Shepperton Studios 2018 Economic Impact Report. Mrs. Evans then sense-checked this figure against reports from other studios, namely a 24 Gillette report based on 2013 figures from Pinewood, a Warner Brothers report based on estimates from productions that took place at that studio between 2019 and 2021, and a Pinewood report from 2022. Mrs. Evans' employment calculations assumed 85% capacity, but as I pointed out in cross-examination, it is notable that these figures all come from production activity that took place at the height of the streaming bubble, when the market circumstances were very different to present-day circumstances, with a very high volume of original film and HGTV productions across streaming platforms. Mrs. Evans agreed with me that we can assume that occupancy rates at those studios were high at the time of the reports she relies on, given what we know about the health of the market at that time. However, Mrs. Evans conceded that she did not account for or make any allowances for changes in occupancy rates since the period of 2013 to 2022, the period of those reports she relied on, to the present day. Instead, as she explained in cross-examination, her calculations would implicitly assume a similar average occupancy rate. Now, this casts further serious doubt on the reliability of Mrs. Evans' employment density calculations. They are based on market dynamics and occupancy rates that are likely to have been higher than today, given the evidence before this inquiry. The Deloitte report, for example, I've cited in a footnote above on occupancy rates, and Mr. Davis, who estimate anywhere between 50 to 65% for current occupancy rates. This is a stark divergence from Mrs. Evans' assumptions of 85% capacity and serves to underscore the unreliability of the calculations. Put simply, ma'am, lower occupancy rates mean less production activity. Less production activity means fewer jobs. For those reasons, there are less people in today's studios than there would have been at the time of the Shepperton Economic Impact Report of 2018, upon which Mrs. Evans relies for her employment density calculations. Mrs. Evans further acknowledged that the amount of studio space has increased significantly in the UK between 2019 and 24, and that an increase in studio space necessarily affects occupancy levels, because if there is more space to go around, workers are less likely to be concentrated in a limited number of studios. Mrs. Evans admitted that she did not take account of the increase in studio space since the period upon which she based her employment density calculations. So finally then, on displacement, there is a recognised chronic skill shortage in the sector. Against this backdrop, it is difficult to understand where the appellant expects the thousands of additional workers they say would service Marlow Film Studios to come from. It will of course take time. It will take time for the skills shortage to be rectified through education and training. And in the meantime, it is reasonable to assume that Marlow Film Studios would merely displace workers from other studios rather than create the additionality required to support the appellant's economic benefits case. And we recall in this regard Mrs. Neville's observations on displacement to studios that are nice to be in. Mrs. Evans' analysis of displacement also suffers from the same lack of market segmentation as Mr. Chordovich's evidence. This contradicts the government guidance for calculating additionality cited in Mrs. Evans' evidence, which states that an assessment of the likely level of displacement can be informed by market analyses. Relevant local markets, including product, property and labour, will need to be carefully assessed. So to conclude then on the economic benefits evidence, Mrs. Evans was quite right to point out in chief that the economics benefits and any assessment of displacement are intricately linked to the appellant's need case. Unfortunately for the appellant, given how the evidence has played out at this inquiry, the appellant's unconvincing need case therefore discredits the case for the economic benefits. And for the reasons already set out, the appellant's need case is fanciful, speculative, and grounded in a rose-tinted view of the market that it wished existed in 25 and beyond, rather than the one that Marlow Film Studios would actually operate in. There is undoubtedly an obvious reason for the appellant taking an approach that is divorced from the current reality. And because, well, they submitted an application in 2022, it must be recalled, and that was before the turmoil caused by the actor strikes and before the effects of the end of the peak TV were fully felt. Now, time's moved on, the market has moved on, but the appellant has decided to stay firmly put in the more favourable circumstances of 2022. However, you, ma'am, of course, have to judge the appellant's need and economic benefits case in the light of today's circumstances, however inconvenient this might be for the appellant's case. Indeed, after reading through hundreds of pages of evidence and sitting through an entire week of need evidence, the only sensible conclusion to make is that the appellant fought its case on need and economic benefits at this inquiry in spite of the evidence, rather than in reliance upon it. So given the above analysis, and when the Council and the Rule 6 parties' respective cases are considered together, the benefits of the appeal scheme do not clearly outweigh the harms, and there are no very special circumstances justifying the release of this greenbelt land for development. And so therefore, ma'am, the Rule 6 party respectfully invites you to recommend that this appeal be dismissed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Nevin. Thank you for those closings. Right, I'm going to suggest a short adjournment comfort break, please, if that's okay with everybody. Got some nods. Can I just make sure that everyone that's not actively participating keeps their cameras off as well as their microphones off, please? That I've seen some cameras flashing up and off, and can you just make sure that they're turned off? Right, it's 5 to 12. We'll come back at 10 past 12 and we're adjourned until then. Thank you. Hello everyone, welcome back. It's 10 past 12. The inquiry is resumed. Mr. Bird and Ms. Drabkin-Reiter, have I said that right?
Reiter, madam.
Reiter. over to you. I do have a copy of your closings as well that I managed to print off, so thank you very much.
And I hope Mr. White has as well. Good. Thank you very much, Madam. As we indicated at the last week of the inquiry, we won't read it all, Madam. We'll edit, cut out various, we'll take as read various sections, but they're there for you to read in due course.
Yeah, thank you. That's great.
And we will share reading responsibilities as we go through. And just by way of introduction, as in opening, the Council's position remains that the appellant has failed to demonstrate the very special circumstances necessary to justify its proposed inappropriate development in the Greenbelt, i.e. whether the harm by reason of inappropriateness and any other harm, Greenbelt and non-Greenbelt harms, would be clearly outweighed by the benefits it advances. The other main issues encompass other freestanding reasons why planning permission should not be granted and or feed into the overall Greenbelt balance, which you must undertake. The appellant has not demonstrated that the appeal site falls within the NPPF's definition of grey belt. It's also failed to prove a demonstrable need for the type of development proposed, or that the development would be in a sustainable location. And so the proposed development must be regarded as inappropriate development in the Greenbelt. In consequence, notwithstanding the revised Greenbelt policy position, for the appeal proposal to be permitted, it must satisfy the very special circumstances test. The changes to the NPPF, both in relation to Greenbelt and economic policy, in paragraphs 85 to 87 of the NPPF, must be understood in the context of the document as a whole. There's been no change to the three overarching objectives of sustainable development of paragraph 8 of the NPPF, nor any change to the recognition in the NPPF that those objectives are interdependent and should be pursued in a mutually supportive way. The continued force of the requirement to comply with the overarching objectives of sustainable development is further underscored by the text added to paragraph 11D2, which confirms that even where the tilted balance applies, growth is not to be encouraged on a free-for-all basis. Development should still be directed to sustainable locations and secure well-designed places, both of which are in play in the present appeal. Further, there's been no lessening to the weight to be given to the harm to the Greenbelt where development is inappropriate, and the new economic policies sit within the context of Greenbelt policy, which is of overarching application. In that context, it's essential that the very special circumstance test is applied correctly and the requisite weight is given to the Greenbelt harms in the overall balance. The NPPF expressly advises that substantial weight must be given to the Greenbelt harm, reflecting the importance of the protection of the Greenbelt in national policy, so important that the presumption against inappropriate development displaces the paragraph 11 tilted balance, which, as explained below, does not avail the appellant in the present. Whilst the very special circumstances test requires a qualitative rather than a quantitative assessment, and it's not necessary for each consideration relied upon in support of Greenbelt development to be very special of itself, the Court of Appeal has stated that the threshold set by the test is higher still than the exceptional circumstances test for Greenbelt release through the development plan process. That's not surprising, as the Greenbelt is a designation of national importance and the strength of its protection must reflect that. And that is a deliberate policy. The fundamental aim of Greenbelt is to prevent urban sprawl by keeping land permanently open. Imposing a very high bar before inappropriate development is permitted in the Greenbelt through the development management process is key to ensuring permanence. Whilst the recent changes to national policy have expanded the categories of appropriate development in the interest of delivering necessary growth, there has been no lessening of the policy protection against inappropriate development. To the extent that the appellant seeks to characterise the Council as a blocker of growth, or as expressing a robust scepticism to such growth, any such allegations find no traction in this case, being both wrong and misplaced. The Council must, of course, ensure that any proposals in its area comply with the principles of sustainable development in the framework and with its own strategy for the development of the area. In that context, the Council strongly supports the Government's growth agenda and has recognised and sought to make provision for both the expansion and modernisation of the creative industries which are clustered in its area. It is strongly supportive of such development when it is proposed in the right location. To that end, it has granted permission for the very significant expansion onto Greenbelt land of the UK's premier film studio, Pinewood Studios. On land released from the Greenbelt and allocated through the Wickham District Local Plan, It also sought to encourage the development of the Wickham Film Studios. The Council thus recognises the need to ensure that the UK's world-leading economic sectors, including the creative industries, can adapt and grow. That is in the interest of both the national and local economy. The appellant itself refers to and relies on a number of local policy and strategy documents promoting film and TV, including the Buckinghamshire Local Industrial Strategy, the Buckinghamshire LEP Strategic Economic Plan, the Buckinghamshire Economic Recovery Plan, and the Strategic Vision for Buckinghamshire. These strategies reflect the Council's ambitions as a corporate entity and chime perfectly with the amendments to the NPPF in December 2024 in terms of their support for the creative and digital sector, the recognition of these sectors' international importance and value, and its role in driving growth. They were ahead of the curve in their recognition of the role and importance of clusters by comparison with paragraphs 85 to 87, having been in existence for a number of years prior to December 2024. However, in the case of this proposed development, the appellant has failed to demonstrate the substantial greenbelt and other harms which its proposals would result in are clearly outweighed by the benefits, when each of the harms and benefits is properly weighted, and the development is not in accordance with the Wickham District Local Plan. Whilst the appellant also sought to make a new claim in evidence that the local plan should be regarded as out of date for the purposes of the NPPF, even if correct, which is disputed, that argument does not avail it because, in the absence of having demonstrated the existence of very special circumstances, the NPPF itself provides a strong reason for refusing planning permission. As explained in opening, reason for refusal 8 and main issue 1, and reason for refusal 9 and main issue J, that should be I, not 1, sorry, and reason for refusal 9 and main issue J can be regarded as resolved, the latter without prejudice to the Council's outstanding reasons for refusal in respect of the highway's impact and unsustainable location of the appeal site. There was some suggestion in the appellant's planning evidence that the Council is to be criticised for its approach to the deferral of the appellant's planning application in October 2023 and the subsequent refusal of planning permission in May 2024, but any such criticism is misplaced. There was no decision on the substantive merits of the application in October 2023, and there's no basis for an implication that, subject to the issues flagged being resolved, a positive decision would be forthcoming at the subsequent consideration of the application. It was for the May 2024 Planning Committee to undertake the balance in the light of the information provided by the appellant then available to it, and that balance resulted in the refusal of planning permission. Madam, the remainder of the closings are then structured in line with the remaining main issues as identified at the opening of the inquiry, starting firstly with whether the proposal would be inappropriate development to the Greenbelt and the effect of the proposal on the openness and purposes of the Greenbelt. So starting with whether the proposal would be inappropriate development in the Greenbelt. The starting point is that the proposal would be inappropriate development in the Greenbelt. In order to find that it is appropriate development, the appellant would have to demonstrate that, in accordance with paragraph 155 of the framework, it is grey belt, there is a demonstrable need for the type of development proposed, and it is in a sustainable location, having regard to, in particular, to paragraphs 110 and 115 of the framework. Starting with 115A, grey belt is defined in the NPPF glossary as land in the green belt comprising previously developed land and or any other land that in either case does not strongly contribute to purposes A, B or D in paragraph 143. While Mr. Fannon rightly accepted that the introduction of grey belt means a less restrictive approach is to be taken to those areas of land which fall within the definition, further guidance on the interpretation and application of this definition is promised in the coming weeks, and clearly the intention of government is only to release those parts of the green belt that are not contributing strongly. In relation to the appeal site, the Council does not consider that it can reasonably be said to meet the NPPF glossary definition, given the strength of its contribution to the meeting of greenbelt purposes A and B. That's ultimately a matter of judgment, and Mr. Sensible agreed with Council's view that the site was not grey belt was a reasonable one, albeit one that he did not share. Pending the formal guidance, Mr. Smith advanced his own criteria for determining a strong contribution to greenbelt purposes, but those have no formal status, are unduly restrictive, and as explained below, potentially almost impossible to satisfy. However, the questions in his table I1 for assessing Greenbelt functionality, when properly applied to the appeal site, demonstrate that it does contribute strongly to purposes A and B. Applying his own criteria, Mr. Smith's assessment is an outlier when compared to the other Greenbelt evidence before you. If Arup had agreed with his 0 out of 5 for purpose A and 1 out of 5 for purpose B, the appeal site would not be in the Greenbelt today, but would instead have been released as part of the Council's Greenbelt review in 2016 and 17. What can be deduced from the definition of Greybelt is that when the government took a conscious decision to exclude purpose C from the Greybelt definition, it nonetheless retained A, B and D, indicating no lessening of the government's commitment to protecting Greybelt land against urban sprawl or the merging of neighbouring towns. It would therefore not be correct to treat all land at the urban edge as Greybelt, as otherwise purpose A would also have been excluded. And I'm going to take paragraphs 17 to 19 as read. They outline the Arup's assessment, and you've got that detail in evidence, and it's there for your subsequent reading. So I'll restart at paragraph 20. You, of course, Madam, also had the benefit of extensive and detailed evidence from 3 expert witnesses on the role both of the Greenbelt generally in the area of the appeal site and the site's contribution to Greenbelt purposes, which are likely to be far greater than that available to the drafters of the Arup survey. And I then start with the appeal site's strong contribution to purpose A. The appeal site strongly contributes to purpose A through its role in checking the unrestricted sprawl of Marlow. The A404, combined with the land on the appeal site, provides a strong and robust Greenbelt boundary to the edge of Marlow that is much stronger than the appellant's proposed new boundary at Westthorpe Park Lane, should be Westthorpe Farm Lane, which is predominantly visible only from the site itself. The railway line to the south is outside the appeal site and would be a particularly weak boundary. As above, this conclusion is consistent with the narrative in the Arup Part 2 assessment. In terms of the score given by Arup to the site's contribution to the purpose, 3 out of 5, this is based on the justification that the A404 provides a strong boundary and therefore checks sprawl so that the connected site performs this role less strongly. However, it is the Greenbelt land coincident with the strong boundary feature, i.e. the A404, which acts together with that feature to create the strong Greenbelt boundary in restricting sprawl. That is also the logic of Arup's narrative, which indicates development beyond the A404 would appear as unplanned sprawl, even if the A404 were released from the Greenbelt. The urban sprawl beyond Marlow's well-defined Greenbelt boundary, through the proposed development's industrial scale buildings in a dense layout across the extent of the site, would be perceived and evident from many vantage points, both within the site and further afield, as demonstrated, for example, in the photo montage for viewpoints 3, P5, 8, 9 and Q. Mr. Smith's test for whether a site conflicts with purpose A, i.e. whether if you move development to a site there would be no other boundary that could contain it, is both illogical and unduly broad. The fact that development could be built up to a different boundary does not mean that development has not sprawled, as every singular area of Greenbelt land will have some further boundary that could ultimately contain development, divesting purpose A of any real meaning or value. The appeal site strongly contributes to Greenbelt purpose A, and the proposed development conflicts with and significantly harms that purpose. Turning to purpose B, the appeal site also contributes strongly to this purpose to prevent neighbouring towns merging into one another. In the Arup Part 1 assessment, General Area 60 was found to contribute strongly, 5 out of 5 to this purpose, and the Arup Part 2 assessment described the appeal site as part of an essential gap between Marlow and Bourne End, and along with other open areas within that gap, it is ultimately important in maintaining the separation between Marlow and Bourne End and between Marlow and Little Marlow. In relation to the Part 2 assessment, as with the Arup assessment of purpose A, it cannot be assumed that the score of 3 out of 5 for purpose B qualifies the appeal site as Greybelt, given the recognition of its role as part of an essential gap, and given it is a significant part of the wider General Area 60, which Arup considered performed the most strongly on its scale. The appeal site of 36 hectares is also 50% larger than the parcel considered in the Part 2 assessment, albeit plots 4 and 5 have a lesser scale and density development proposed for them. From a number of vantage points, as demonstrated in particular by viewpoint P5, but also viewpoints C, D, E and F along Marlow Road, A4155, the proposed development will visibly diminish the open countryside character of that essential gap, especially between Marlow and Little Marlow. In views from Winter Hill, the proposed development would also erode the perceived separation in views of Marlow and High Wycombe, as evident in viewpoint 8. These views clearly show the position taken by Mr. Smith that one cannot say the development would have an effect on the sense of separation between those two settlements is wrong. Indeed, he later accepted in cross-examination that the development would result in the perception of Marlow moving closer to Little Marlow. Applying Mr. Smith's self-collective criterion on coalescence, that a strongly performing parcel of land would be the only space between two settlements, would be open and free from built development with no perception of built development available from publicly accessible viewpoints, it would be almost impossible to ever have a parcel which strongly contributes to Greenbelt Purpose B, as it is entirely typical for built development to be visible across a gap, especially where the site is the only residual element of a gap. Whilst the assessment against Purpose B is not a mathematical exercise, but rather an exercise of judgment, it's also relevant that the extent of the reduction in physical terms is very significant. 22% of the gap to Bourne End and 49% of the gap to Little Marlow. Much was made by the appellant of the apparent conflict between the evidence of Mr. Fannin, who maintained that there will be perceived coalescence between settlements as a result of the proposed development and therefore conflict with and significant harm to Greenbelt Purpose B, and the evidence of Mr. Kennett on an assessment of the proposed development against Local Plan Policy DM 324. On this single point of difference, the evidence of Mr. Fannin should be preferred. He is the council's witness on Greenbelt, whose judgment was based on a detailed written assessment and oral evidence. By contrast, Mr. Kennett was responding to questions of Greenbelt which he made plain he was not giving evidence on and deferred to Mr. Fannin on. That does not diminish the weight to be given to the rest of Mr. Kennett's evidence, which was based on his own careful consideration of the landscape and visual effects of the proposed development as set out in his written evidence and expanded on orally. It also cannot be the case that perceived or actual coalescence would have to occur should a site be developed before it can be concluded that a parcel of land strongly contributes to Purpose B, as that could have been made explicit in the Greenbelt definition. Given the word strongly implies a range and not a single point on a scale, there must be situations where no perceived or actual coalescence would result, and yet a parcel contributes strongly to this purpose. Madam, the council's case is the appeal site does contribute strongly to Purpose B, and the proposed development conflicts with and significantly harms this purpose. Turning then to 155B of the framework, no demonstrable need. On the evidence before this inquiry, there is no demonstrable unmet need for the type of development proposed, as discussed more fully under the main issue C below. Paragraph 155B requires the demonstration of a current unmet need. There is a demonstrable unmet need, emphasis added, rather than a mere aspiration or ambition. That is a high threshold, no doubt deliberately set by government as such. It is set to avoid use by speculative proposals or those where the justification lacks certainty. Those are properly pursued, if at all, through the development plan process. As a matter of approach, the appellant's recent claim that paragraphs 85 to 87 of the NPPF, and in particular 87A, mean that the need for development supporting the creative industries is to be taken as read, and therefore demonstrable need is established automatically for any development falling within paragraph 87, is obviously wrong. The focus of paragraph 87 is on making provision where it's needed in specific locations to support growth. In turn, that makes it material to consider what the need is for those particular sectors and the extent of the need, including the extent to which the need could be satisfied by development in the pipeline. Paragraph 87 does not identify a demonstrable need for any given development. Further, paragraph 155B does not say, either in terms or by reference to a footnote, that development which supports the industries referred to in paragraph 87A by definition satisfies the requirement to show demonstrable need. Had the government intended such an approach, it would have made that clear, as it has with the explicit inclusion of the 5-year housing land supply in footnote 56. It is noteworthy that even for housing, another national growth priority, need is not assumed but must be demonstrated. Mr Sensible, when challenged on his new claims, was at pains to confirm that he was not advocating for an approach that anything goes. However, the logical conclusion of his argument, given paragraph 87 applies to plan making as well as decision taking, is that the NPPF would require all plans to have a policy with sufficient flexibility to accommodate any scale of development which falls within the scope of paragraph 87A and B, irrespective of limit. That cannot be right, as it would be a licence to permit any scale of development wherever it might fall and irrespective of constraints. Such an approach would fly in the face of ensuring that the three objectives in paragraph 8 of the framework are met in mutually supportive ways. And I'm going to take 37 and 38 as read. We'll come back to sustainable location and we'll move to the effect of the proposal of the openness and purposes of the Green Belt. And Madam here, I'll take 39 as read and move straight to 41 and purpose C. Significant harm would be caused as a result of conflict with purpose C, assisting in safeguarding the countryside from encroachment, even taking into account all the proposed mitigation measures in the form of building design and screen planting. The proposed development would result in a significant scale of urbanising development that will encroach onto open countryside, notwithstanding the semi-urban influences to which it is subject. The existing character of the appeal site, which is largely rural and open and separated from the well-defined edge of Marlow, will be significantly undermined. This encroachment can be perceived from clearly defined views of the site from Winter Hill and Bloom Hill in the national landscape, as well as from the Volvo footbridge, the public right-of-way which traverses the site, the A404 and Marlow Road 4155. The activity generated in the Greenbelt and the associated vehicular traffic would further contribute to the sense of encroachment. The proposed development would also considerably harm Greenbelt Purpose E, whilst it's accepted that available non-Greenbelt site of a size to accommodate the appeal proposals as advanced would be limited within the catchment selected by the appellant. The appellant's alternative sites assessment appears to have been tailored to support the case for the proposals and is dependent on acceptance of the appellant's need and critical mass arguments. These have not been proven through the evidence before the inquiry, and the lack of alternative non-Greenbelt and now Grainbelt sites has therefore not been clearly demonstrated. Concerns were raised in the officer's report regarding the scope of the appellant's alternative sites assessment. Had it been tailored to a smaller site and over a wider catchment, it would likely have generated more potential sites, and the Council considers that the lack of alternative non-Greenbelt sites has not been clearly demonstrated. There is, as a matter of fact, no evidence before the inquiry as to how this site was selected by the appellant for development as a film studio. It's clear from the evidence of Mr. Pryor the proposals were designed to the site that was available. The proposed number of film and HGTV productions for the site could be accommodated on a development comprising 14 rather than 18 sound stages. Therefore, the fact that the appeal site is 36 hectares should not be a key determinant of whether the appellant has sufficiently demonstrated that any need for the development cannot be satisfied on other non-Greenbelt land. As explained by Mr. Fannin, any need could be accommodated in different ways, for example, on smaller sites and in urban areas. On the appellant's critical mass argument, the Council's consultants, Lambert Smith Hampton, who were instructed to review the economic case in support of the application, found that the critical mass can be whilst critical mass can be a benefit to the industry at a cluster level, it's less so at a site level. As stated in Lambert Smith Hampton's update report, we acknowledge the benefits of critical mass, but remain of the opinion that there's not a material difference in terms of wider economic and production industry benefits between either to one large facility or a collection of smaller studios within a locality. We doubt that any single production occupier has a specific requirement for this quantum. While Grade A studios may be bigger to support tentpole film production and HGTV productions, larger studios already exist and are not fully utilised. In the context of development on a Greenbelt site allocated for outdoor recreation, a key consideration of the very special circumstances balance is whether the claimed need can be met other than through the proposed development. Given the evidence before the inquiry of underutilisation and the pipeline supply, the alternative sites assessment does not support the proposals. There is therefore a conflict with purpose E, and this purpose is harmed to a considerable extent. Madam, I'm going to take 46 to 49 as read in terms of the effect on openness, but they're there for you to read in due course. I conclude on main issue A. The appeal site is not Greybelt, given its strong contribution to Greenbelt purposes A and B, nor can the proposed development be considered appropriate in Greenbelt due to the lack of a demonstrable need for the type of development proposed and the failure to locate it in a sustainable location. Harm would therefore be caused to the Greenbelt by definition, with significant harm to Greenbelt purposes A, B and C, and considerable harm to Greenbelt purpose E. There would be very significant spatial and visual harm to the openness of the Greenbelt, and the proposed development would also conflict with the spatial strategy of the plan, CP8 and DM42, which govern the development of the Greenbelt, and RUR4 of the local plan, which restricts uses in Little Marlow Lakes Country Park to those consistent with its Greenbelt status. These conclusions feed into the overall planning balance and require the demonstration of very special circumstance, which we will turn to below. I'm going to then turn over to Ms. Fradkin-Wright, who will deal with the RUR4 issue.
Thanks, Madam. So turning to main issue B, the effect of the proposal on the function and amenities of the surrounding area. The proposed development conflicts with local plan policy RUR4, which allocates the 329-hectare Little Marlow Lakes Country Park for outdoor recreation. RUR4 provides in relevant part that the Little Marlow Lakes Country Park, of which the appeal site forms a material part and falls wholly within, is allocated for outdoor recreation. It states that any development within the country park should provide for environmental improvements, including the provision of publicly accessible open space, ecological and biodiversity enhancements, and contribute to the continued development and long-term management of the country park. It also confirms that planning permission will not be granted for development within the country park, which prejudices the function of the area for the purposes of a country park, and that any development will be required to provide safe, convenient and direct access to Marlow and Bourne End for pedestrians, cyclists and disabled users. The supporting text to the policy identifies it as an opportunity to deliver SANG to facilitate housing development elsewhere in the local plan area, and notes that by designating the area as a country park, it further limits development opportunities to those associated with outdoor sport and recreation, as long as it preserves the openness of the Greenbelt that further the purposes of the country park. Policy CP1 of the local plan confirms that the plan policies, along with the strategic objectives and the delivery and site allocations plan, represent the council's locally distinct interpretation of sustainable development for the district. Policy CP2 sets the overall spatial strategy for the district, confirming that the council will, through the allocations and policies in the plan, meet as much of the district's need for housing and employment land as is sustainable to do so, as set out in policy CP4 and CP5, whilst protecting areas where development should be restricted, including protect the Greenbelt by only releasing land from the Greenbelt where there are exceptional circumstances for doing so. And figure 4 in the local plan identifies broad locations for main employment proposals and brownfield development. The RUR4 area is already meeting the principal statutory purpose of a country park. It currently accommodates a variety of leisure uses on both council-owned and privately owned land, which include walking and enjoying nature along public and permissive paths, as well as publicly accessible private activities, including fishing, water sports, open water swimming, camping and other outdoor activities. As volunteered by Mr Sensical, this is an area where the council are looking to promote outdoor recreation, and that is happening. Councillor Crabtree, a parish councillor for Little Marlow Parish Council, within which the appeal site falls, explained that walking routes around plot 4 are very heavily used. As set out in the Little Marlow Gravel Pits SPG, delivery of the country park requires working with developers to bring it forward in the context of the existing policy framework and guidance. The master plan vision, as set out in the SPG, is that in essence envisages only a limited amount of change, with a large amount of the area devoted to quiet enjoyment and low intensity uses. Wickham District Council resolved to designate the land covered by policy RUR4 formally as a country park in 2017. While this designation was not completed, the council agreed to retain a commitment to the whole of the country park area, with the initial phase of delivery covering land in the council's ownership. This approach does not rule out the future expansion of the designation to cover the whole of the area. There is no basis for saying that the policy is out of date because the allocated area has not been formally designated and might not be in the future. The appellant's argument to the contrary ignores the fact that RUR4 is not predicated on formal designation, and the spatial element of the policy, which restricts development to particular uses within the area it covers, remains valid regardless of any such formal designation. As Mr. Fannin explained, the policy allocates land for a particular use, leisure and recreation. It is not a site allocation which presupposes a particular development. It continues to serve a purpose in restricting the uses which can take place on both privately owned and council land, uses which have been promoted through the council's efforts to identify and implement SANG in the Spade Oak area and make provision for recreation on that SANG. It is common ground that policy RUR4 allocates the area it covers for outdoor recreation use. The proposed use of the site as a film studio is not an outdoor recreation use, and the proposal is therefore clearly contrary to policy RUR4. Even with mitigation, the industrial nature and large scale of development is such that it will significantly prejudice the function of the allocated country park as a whole. It would occupy nearly 10% of the allocated area in close proximity to Marlow, directly adjacent to the Chilterns National Landscape and within its setting. It would disconnect the country park from Marlow. Pedestrians accessing the country park from Marlow would first have to traverse the film studio site, eliminating the existing open countryside character and adding to the separation between the settlement and the recreation area. The council's position on the conflict with policy RUR4 and the harm that would be caused to the function of the allocated country park as a whole was not challenged by the appellant in oral evidence. The council acknowledges that the appeal proposal would enable the delivery of some of the aims of policy RUR4, including connectivity. These are benefits which are given appropriate weight in the planning balance. However, even taking into account such improvements, the development would conflict with the overall purpose of the policy to limit development to outdoor sport and recreation, which preserves the openness of the greenbelt and furthers the purposes of a country park. So by its failure to restrict the use of the appeal site to the allocated use of outdoor recreation, the proposed development undermines the spatial strategy of the local plan and does not represent sustainable development as defined in policy CP1. It therefore gives rise to conflict with the local plan CP1 and CP2, as well as with policy RUR4 and the Little Marlow Gravel Pits SPG. And I'll now pass back to Mr. Bird for main issue C.
I'm going to turn to the need for the proposal. The appellant has failed to prove that a demonstrable need exists for the proposed development. It was formulated at a time when the streaming wars were at their peak and production expenditure in the UK reached £6.9 billion, supported by the wide range of stage space available across the UK. Over the past 5 years, studio space has increased significantly faster than the production spend, and a considerable amount of new studio space was added to the market in 2021 and 2022. There is no shortage of available soundstage at the moment. Even on the appellant's case, it's likely that the existing and pipeline supply of soundstage will be sufficient to meet the projected demand over the next 5 years, and there remains significant uncertainty regarding whether the core South East market will be undersupplied in the future. As Mrs. Neville accepted, neither the BFI nor the BFC has identified through forecasting any likely deficiency in soundstage space going forward, whether in the UK generally, the Metro London cluster or the West London cluster. Even the BFC, as the promotional national agency for the industry, has stated that it has no concerns about studio capacity and is not itself seeking to stimulate any new studio development. That is unsurprising because analysis of the available data provided by the appellant shows that existing soundstage is operating at just 42.6% capacity. As a matter of fact, there was £7.6 billion worth of production spend on UK stage space in 2022, a level which on current forecasts is unlikely to be seen again until after 2029. Mr. Jodorowicz's firm's forecast is that £7 billion of production spend will not be exceeded until at least 2028. There exists a very substantial pipeline supply of Grade A and other studio space to facilitate growth and increase market share without the need for the appeal proposal. Prior to the opening of this inquiry, the available figures for film and HGTV spend in 2024 showed a production spend of £4.7 billion with an expectation of a full year level of production spend of £6.27 billion. The full statistics for 2024, released on the 6th of February 2025, show a significant shortfall against that expectation, with the final published figures indicating a production spend of just £5.6 billion for 2024. Ben Roberts, BFI's chief executive, is quoted in the BFI press release as saying, "We know these figures don't tell the whole story. The 22% drop in domestic HGTV spend is a reminder that many in this industry are feeling the pressure, and what happens next will be critical." And Adrian Wooden, chief executive of the British Film Commissioner, as saying that we're cautiously optimistic and we're still waiting for the market to settle to reach a new normal. Mr. Todorovic's view, as expressed in oral evidence, that the 2024 figures would show a significant bounce back from 2023 to at least £6 billion, has not been borne out. The experience of the past 2 years reinforces Lambert Smith Hampton's advice to the Council that all historical forecast models for future demand are invalidated until a new stabilised trend in production spend is re-established. It cannot be claimed that the film industry is in a period of continuous or rapid growth. On the appellant's own case, the existing capacity of the UK stage space is capable of supporting a production spend of £8.9 billion. That is without any of the existing consented pipeline supply being built. An existing studio space is heavily underutilised. Knight Frank's data corroborates the prediction by Deloitte of capacity utilisation in the short term of just 50% of the available stage space in London and the South East. The amount of floor space per £1 billion of production spend has significantly increased since 2020 to 2021, demonstrating the existing floor space is capable of being used more effectively than is presently the case, and there is a surplus of space with regard to the current level of production. Whilst the appellant has presented various forecasts of demand for stage space over time, it is inherently difficult to forecast future studio demand. For example, Mr. Todorovich recognised that his own firm's forecast for 2024, undertaken in June 2022, was 77% higher than the spend of £6.2 billion predicted for 2024 on the basis of the BFI 2024 Q1, Q3 spend. Those forecasts are even further removed from the actual figures for 2024 published earlier this month. Similarly, the Knight Frank forecast horizon to 2029, which was based on a BFI 2024 Q1 to Q3 spend of £4.7 billion on film and high-end TV, and extrapolating this for the whole of 2024, gave a baseline of £7.06 billion for projecting demand from 2024 onwards. If the actual baseline of £5.6 billion is inserted into Knight Frank's forward demand projections, forecast spend in 2029 would be lower, proportionately 7.04, and not close to their £9.3 billion. Importantly, as we've said, if the Knight Frank approach were adopted, whether one applies their predicted 2024 baseline or the actual baseline for 2024, the UK has sufficient studio capacity to accommodate growth for the foreseeable future, even without any pipeline. The calculations relied on in Mr. Todorovich's note in response do not materially advance the appellant's case. They still indicate that existing studio space has capacity to support £8.9 billion production spend and therefore is capable of supporting significant growth without any additional studio space coming forward from the pipeline supply. There is ample scope both to accommodate growth and to capture increased market share without the need for the proposed development. Forecasts remain particularly difficult at this point of time, given the major US production corporates' change focus from growth to profitability and uncertainty as to whether the actors and writers' strikes in the US were the principal cause for the reduction in production spend or are masking an underlying reduction. But certainly the final figures for 2024 do not indicate a return to levels of growth which give rise to any cause for concern in respect of the quantum of stage space. On the appellant's own forecast, a recently constructed and pipeline well-placed supply in the Metro London cluster of 2.095 million square feet of stage space, 1.3 million square feet in the West London cluster alone, can deliver some 83 sound stages if required, and as accepted by Mr Davis, are capable by itself of attracting between 2.5 billion and £3 billion worth of additional production spend, depending on the spend per square foot ratio applied. This takes no account of pipeline supply outside the Metro London cluster and no account of any pipeline Grade B supply. Part of the Grade A supply is at two of the UK's world-class studios, and save for Leeston, there's nothing to indicate that it would not be available to the market generally, as opposed to occupied under an MLA. And the evidence is that there is existing available capacity at the two newest facilities, Shinfield and Eastbrook. Therefore, the supply is plainly adequate in both quantitative and qualitative terms. Along with greater utilisation of the existing stage space, the capacity is more than capable of meeting Knight Frank's forecast demand until 2029 and accommodating an increase in market share. As to Mr Chodorovic's approach, which was to seek to ascertain what he referred to as the addressable market, and compare that with the expenditure which the pipeline supply and proposed development would be capable of supporting, that does not in any sense demonstrate a need for the proposed development and a development of its size, not least on a greenbelt site. His analysis assumes that demand will simply follow supply, given the available spend in the total addressable market, in contrast with what is known to be happening elsewhere in the West London cluster, where the evidence indicates insufficient market certainty or demand to bring pipeline supply forward or utilise existing space, including that of Grade A quality, more intensively. As agreed by Mrs Evans, the pipeline supply would be capable of competing for any increase in the share of the addressable market that the UK is capable of attracting, and it was no part of her case that the pipeline supply was any less likely to come forward than the proposed development were the demand there. Knight Frank's forecast demand is also one for the West London cluster, which excludes existing and pipeline supply in parts of London and the South East, which do not fall within its claimed boundaries. The West London cluster has no formal status. The BFI identifies the focus as being a wider Metro London cluster, and its boundaries have expanded as new facilities are provided, for example, at Shinfield. It reflects where demand has been met in the South East over time, as opposed to being a reliable indicator of where demand needs to be met now. As Mr Chodorovich confirmed, the UK competes for its market share in film and HETV on a national basis, and other studios across the 7 established studio clusters in the UK are all capable of contributing to the increased market share he advocates for. Mr Davis confirmed that it's no part of his case that studios and new studio stage space outside the West London cluster are unviable, and in his own description of the cluster, Mr Davis repeatedly refers to a broader area of London and the South East and Greater London. None of this is to deny that there is a cluster, that the weighting of the cluster is to the west of London, or that the appeal site falls within any reasonable definition of the cluster. However, it is not alone in that context, and there is a more advanced pipeline of supply of greater quantum than the appellant chooses to acknowledge, which is capable of meeting the forecastable demand in both quantitative and qualitative terms, while supporting the aspirations for increased UK market share. This is also without any further potential sites for stage-based development, which might be identified by a more rigorous alternative sites assessment, as already touched on under Greenbelt Purpose E. In that context, it's relevant that Grade B studios, temporary sound stages and other lower grade stage space cannot be characterised as incapable of offering good quality space or as being unfit for 21st century production as a generality. As has occurred at Longcross and Shepperton, it is possible to invest in existing studios to bring them up to what appears to be a Grade A level. Within the cluster, both Grade A and B studios and other spaces operate in tandem to provide space of all sizes and budgets as an ecosystem of production space. The evidence of the actual market provides a sense check to the appellant's need case. Due to a combination of concerns about demand, competing supply, overhanging construction inflation, very few new pipeline developments have commenced since 2022. That experience reflects this That reflects the council's experience with progress on the Pinewood expansion on hold and Wickham Studios proposals being abandoned. Mr Davis was at pains to emphasise that a prudent landowner would seek other more profitable uses to increase the value of the land, but that of course would also apply to the appeal side. His evidence does not demonstrate a need, but rather supports the absence of sufficient market demand for additional studio space, whether Grade A or otherwise. Mrs Evans accepted that Pinewood and Wickham were relevant pipeline supply that would be available where they're interested in the market, bringing them forward. And whilst Ms Waite described Grade A studio space as being in high demand in early 2025, 2 out of the 8 studios could give her a pencil, which even for those lower down in the list could still result in securing studio space. She declined to put down a pencil in any event because of a lack of clarity as to where the producer and financier would determine that her particular film should be made. She also accepted that Grade B stage space would be fit for purpose and would not be unsafe or unsatisfactory for crew. Rather than the supply of sound space, the more pressing issue appears to be a skills shortage, the existence of which is common ground among all the need witnesses before the inquiry. In order to ensure the sustainable growth of the film production industry, it is important that growth in crew numbers is in balance with the levels of production space. Mr Davis refers to an additional 21,000 additional crew required to meet the forecast demand for 2025 alone, and it's not in dispute that many thousands will be needed to support the anticipated growth of market share in the future, as argued for by the appellant. It is not possible to train the necessary specialist workforce as quickly as studios can be built, and there is therefore a need for balance between studio supply and the crew to service that supply. There is simply no evidence that the skilled crew necessary to support the appellant's more ambitious growth forecast would be available in the timescales assumed in their forecast. So, Madam, in conclusion on need, notwithstanding the considerable amount of evidence the appellant has decided to call, it has not been able to prove that a demonstrable need exists for the appeal proposals. This means that the proposed development cannot be considered appropriate development on Greybell, which is true for a number of other reasons as explained already in these submissions. It also significantly undermines the appellant's very special circumstances case. And I'm going to turn to main issue D, which is the effect of the proposal on the character and appearance of the area, including the setting of the national landscape. And Ms Drabkin-Writer is going to pick up again here.
Madam, the proposed development would cause significant harm to landscape character and visual amenity beyond the appeal site and its immediate context. It would fail to satisfy the recreational policy objectives of policy IUR4, would not achieve a sense of place that improves the character and quality of the local area as required by policy CP9 and DM35, would not conserve, protect and enhance the children's national landscape, including by avoiding or minimising harm in its setting as sought by policies CP10, DM30 and paragraphs 187A and 189 of the framework, and would not protect and reinforce the positive key characteristics of the receiving landscape pattern as sought by policy DM32 and paragraph 135 of the framework. At the outset, it must be noted that there is a significant degree of concordance between the parties' experts in terms of their assessment of harm to landscape character and visual amenity. It is agreed that the tables in Mr Kennett's rebuttal proof of evidence are a fair representation of both sides' positions on those effects. Where there is a difference, the difference is typically no more than one rung in terms of the level of harm identified. Both parties find a material degree of harm to both landscape character and visual amenity. To the extent that there is any challenge to the Council's evidence in terms of approach, Mr Kennett was clear in his evidence that he adopted the Gillespie's methodology in assessing the impact of the appeal proposals, and his narrative explains clearly where and why he differs in terms of the judgments reached by both Gillespie's, Pegasus and Mr Smith. The characterisation of some moderate effects as significant and others as not significant fully accords with Glivia 3, which in any event is not a formulaic recipe and is an approach that was taken by Mr Smith in his own bespoke methodology. Now turning to landscape character, Madam, and I propose to leave paragraph 79 and 80 as read and turn to paragraph 81. While Marlow, the surrounding road network and lighting do have an influence on the landscape character of the appeal site, and it might be said to have an urban edge character, development on the appeal site would add to built form in the valley and reinforce that urban fringe to the detriment of the open rural character of fields and lakes. The urban influences of Marlow on the appeal site and its context are also counterbalanced by more natural and rural features, such as the fact that the A404 is tree-lined along much of its length, providing a softening character. Tree planting is very well established within Marlow itself, and the wider urban area is quite broken up through intermittent trees amongst buildings. The combination of trees at the edge of Marlow and the A404 gives a green edge and results in Marlow being well integrated in the landscape. Again, I'll take paragraph 82 to 85 as read and begin again at 86. The landscape character areas to the north and south of the appeal site are highly relevant to the assessment of the effects of development on the appeal site. The LCAs to the north and south of the Thames borrow heavily from each other, as there is a high degree of intervisibility between them. That intervisibility forms a large part of the character and amenity to the public of the area. In terms of the use and condition of the appeal site, it has been restored after mineral extraction and landfilling operations over a number of years. Although that restoration has not been carried out well, the appearance of the site has much in common with the surrounding countryside, in contrast with the urban area of Marlow to the west. The neglect of the site since its restoration has compounded this, but as evident from figure A2 appended to Mr. Kennett's proof of evidence, there are straightforward measures which could be taken to restore the site for open field, agricultural or informal recreation use. The site lies in an area which has well-established recreational uses which have informed and linked with the policy RUR4 allocation as a country park, as illustrated on figure A3 to Mr. Kennett's appendices, which the appellant agrees is an accurate representation. As well as the public right-of-way which crosses the appeal site, there is also footpath access to the Thames path across the railway line. Turning then to landscape value. Whilst there is a difference between Mr. Kennett and Mr. Smith as to the value of the appeal site in landscape terms, which then informs the judgment as to the sensitivity of the site, that in turn informs the significance of the landscape effects. Despite that difference, Mr. Kennett and Mr. Smith both conclude that the appeal proposal would result in major moderate negative landscape effects on the site and its immediate context within the Thames floodplain LCA 26.1. However, the difference in value, it bears on whether the appeal site falls within a valued landscape, thereby engaging the protection of paragraph 187A of the NPPF as contended for by the Council. As confirmed by Mr. Kennett, he has ascribed the same value to the appeal site throughout his consideration of the proposed development, but only gave formal consideration to whether the appeal site fell within the NPPF definition of valued landscape when the matter was raised in discussions on the landscape statement of common ground. He fairly accepted that this was an oversight, but that does not detract from his structured assessment and conclusion that the appeal site is part of a valued landscape. In any event, as we have said, the position of the parties on value is reasonably aligned. The difference relates predominantly to whether the appeal site, as part of a wider valued landscape, tips into the threshold of paragraph 187A. In terms of approach, value must be judged at the scale at which the landscape is enjoyed. In considering value, it is important to consider not only the site itself and its features, elements, characteristics and qualities, but also their relationship with and the role they play within the site's context. It is common ground that the appeal site can be appreciated as part of a wider landscape in views from Winter Hill, and the scope of that landscape and appreciation will vary according to perspective. The site can be experienced to the north, east and south, and there is interdependence between the site and the areas from which it is experienced. Bearing that in mind, the site falls within a valued landscape which comprises the mosaic of fields, lakes and hedges to the east of Marlow, south of the A4155 and north of Winter Hill. Its value is enhanced by its proximity to Winter Hill and the national landscape, because it is an integral part of the wider landscape. By contrast, the approach of Mr. Smith to consider the site on its own on the basis that this is where the direct effects of development will occur is wrong and in conflict with the guidance in TJN 221. Determining the value of a landscape is separate and necessarily prior to considering the effects of development. The extent of a landscape will not be determined by a particular red line boundary of an application or a plot selected for development, but by the physical and visual features of that landscape. A non-exhaustive list of factors to be considered is set out in the Landscape Institute's TGN 221. The relative importance of those factors in determining value will vary from case to case, and if other factors indicate value, poor condition per se should not be determinative of status. The landscape of which the appeal site forms an integral part now constitutes a series of lakes and fields fringed with trees, hedges and scrub. Open water bodies are somewhat rare within the wider landscape, giving rise to a distinctive landscape of highly scenic qualities. There is a mosaic of habitats with significant conservation and natural heritage interests, and the landscape is rich in recreational activity, including walking, birdwatching, fishing and water sports. The site and its immediate landscape have a historic connection and association with Westhorpe House and other nearby designated heritage assets. The landscape also has important physical and visual connections with the Chilterns National Landscape to the north and Winter Hill to the south, and contributes significant physical separation between the built-up areas of Marlow and Little Marlow and Bourne End. It also contributes an open countryside setting to the national landscape to the north. It is material that the site is part of a wider area subject to the Chilterns National Landscape Boundary Review, and Natural England has confirmed that this area has met the criteria for inclusion in the Chilterns National Landscape. This is a strong indication that the landscape containing the appeal site is of a sufficiently high quality to be considered a valued landscape in its present use and condition. Turning to landscape effects, again, proposed to take paragraph 96 as read. It is agreed that the proposed development would have a major moderate adverse impact on the landscape character of the appeal site itself. The appellant claims that there would be no significant landscape effects beyond the site and its immediate context. This is founded principally on the contention that, because the landscape of the Thames Valley is a settled one, making it more settled cannot result in significant effects because there is no change to the overall composition of the landscape. However, this does not properly reflect the role which the appeal site plays in the wider, sensitive landscape or the effects of settlement as they read within that landscape. As an example of his exaggeration of the effect of existing settlement on landscape character, Mr. Smith concludes that no effect on landscape character beyond the site itself will be greater than slight. You will reach your own judgment, but the Council's position is that it is clear that there will be a significant change in overall composition, evidenced, for example, at viewpoint P5. Mr. Smith's assessment also fails to take into account the fact that the type of development proposed, very large sheds, is not reflected in either the LCA within which the appeal site sits or the adjoining LCAs. Urban edge influences from Marlow, such as existing employment sites at Globe Business Park and Marlow International, are relied on by Mr. Smith as a key factor, but they are not comparable in terms of the type of development proposed on the appeal site, having regard to its scale, form and intensity. Mr. Smith unduly elevates the influence of Marlow in reducing the magnitude of the effect of the development on the landscape character outside the appeal site. He fails to recognise that Marlow is very clearly set to one side of the A404, with the countryside on the other side, and the proposed development results in a significant change of perception with the development crossing the A404 into adjacent countryside. By contrast, the focusing of development on plots 1, 2 and 3, with more limited development in plots 4 and 5, brings it closer to the national landscape, and the choice to clad the multi-storey car park in lighter coloured materials and to face its wide elevation to the national landscape also means that it will read very differently in character terms to the edge of Marlow. The proposed development will also prevent characteristic views into the national landscape from footpath 21 and the footbridge over the A404, would mean that the edge of Marlow would do more than filter beyond the A404. It would enclose and prevent views out across the Thames floodplain and into the national landscape and introduce a sense of enclosure along the southern boundary of the national landscape. On visual effects, it is common ground that there are sensitive views from, to and across the site, particularly views into or across the site from the national landscape to the north and Winter Hill to the south. In the immediate vicinity of the appeal site, the incongruous dense industrial development of the appeal proposal will be visible from the public right-of-way which traverses the appeal site east-west. Also from the access road to Westhorpe House and Westhorpe Park, and from the A404 and A4155 Westhorpe interchange at the northern edge of the site. Recreational users on the public right-of-way crossing the site will experience a major moderate adverse effect as they approach the proposed development, and a clearer view is obtained of the large sheds, which do not step down to the edge of the appeal site in this location. The proposed development will also appear very close to the residential properties at Westhorpe House and Westhorpe Park, and will be a significant change to the visual amenity they currently experience. Residential receptors in the Westthorpe Park homes, who live in small prefabricated properties with very small gardens, will experience visual effects beyond their homes and gardens, on the access road and on the surrounding permissive path and informal access land, which they currently make significant amenity and recreational use of. The effect on residential receptors will be moderate, adverse and significant. The proposed development will also be highly visible from public rights-of-way in the Chilterns National Landscape. There are regular views of the appeal site throughout the adjoining part of the Chilterns National Landscape from a variety of public rights-of-way. At closer quarters, the proposed development will be highly visible where its dense industrial character will appear incongruous in the countryside, breaking the visual and physical continuity between the Chilterns National Landscape and the adjacent Thames Valley. In terms of the examples, I'll leave them for you to read, Madam. But moving to paragraph 105, in relation to Winter Hill, the long-ranging views northwards across the Thames floodplain and into the Chilterns National Landscape are an essential part of its landscape character and visual amenity. From the public rights-of-way and open access land, where the viewing receptors are of high sensitivity, there are intermittent views of the Thames Valley floor and the appeal site, with the Chilterns National Landscape as a backdrop. Where these views open up, they are often dramatic and clearly valued, including a designated viewpoint. The proposed development would introduce an extensive area of dense buildings with an industrial character across a number of views, presenting a more intrusive, urbanised edge to Marlow and introducing a degree of separation from the Thames floodplain landscape in the foreground and the Chilterns National Landscape beyond. Again, I'll leave the examples for you to read, Madam. So turning to harm to the national landscape, it is common ground that the proposed development is in the setting of the national landscape as defined in the Chilterns Conservation Board position statement. The recent amendment to Section 85 of the Countryside and Rights of Way Act extends the duty to conserve natural beauty to development not just in the national landscape, but also in its setting, and seeks also to enhance natural beauty. Given the harms to landscape character and visual identity already identified, the proposed development will cause harm to the national landscape and lessen its natural beauty by reason of the impact of harmful development within its setting. The views into and out of the national landscape have significant considerations in terms of understanding its natural beauty and how its setting contributes to that, and so logically must be relevant to assessing whether there is indirect harm to the national landscape. There are regular views of the appeal site throughout this part of the national landscape from a variety of public rights of way. At close quarters, the proposed development will be highly visible where its dense industrial character of substantial height and scale will appear incongruous, breaking the visual continuity between the national landscape and the adjacent Thames Valley. This will result in a major adverse effect. Whilst within the national landscape, the visual effects will reduce as the viewer takes in the wider landscape, the reduction will not be as marked as Mr. Smith contends for, with significant effects extending well into the national landscape, becoming not significant only with greater distance towards Blackwell Heath. The proposed development will therefore harm the special qualities of the national landscape, including panoramic views and the experience of those enjoying the network of footpaths from which the character and beauty of the national landscape can be appreciated as part of its special qualities. It is common ground that in views from the national landscape, the condition of the appeal site is not perceptible, and nor are the ruderal species, and the negative aspects of landscape character identified in the RCAs do not impair or adversely affect those views and the experience along the footpaths, which are part of the special qualities of the national landscape. The mitigation measures proposed by the appellant cannot materially lessen the effects which it will have on landscape character and visual amenity, which are a product of the scale and height and dense layout of the proposed development and where it sits in the landscape. As confirmed by Mr. Kennett, his principal concern in landscape terms is the scale and form of the proposed development and its concentration in the northern part of the site, where it has a greater impact on the national landscape. As is now evident from the appellant's evidence, this is a scheme which has been driven by the concept of a dense, intensive development with a resulting form and scale which simply cannot be satisfactorily mitigated by the quality of design of the buildings themselves. It will impose itself on the landscape rather than integrate into it. So by reason of the harm to the character and quality of the area and the Chilterns National Landscape, the proposed development conflicts with local plan policies CP9, CP10, RUR4, DM30, DM32, DM35, and delivery and site allocations plan policy DM11. It is also contrary to the guidance in paragraphs 135, 187 and 189 of the framework. And I'll pass back to Ms Bird for next main issues.
I'm now going to turn to main issues E, F and G, the effect of the proposal on the surrounding road network, active and sustainable modes of travel and the safety of highway users, dealing with E and F together. Active and sustainable modes of travel are not of sufficient quality to make the appellant's proposed mode share a realistic outcome. It's convenient to take main issues E and F together, as I've said, as the failure of the proposal to support active and sustainable modes of travel, particularly walking and cycling, in part demonstrates why the appellant has not shown that there will not be a severe impact, cumulative residual impact on the road network as a result of the proposed development. For the avoidance of doubt, subject to the commitment to fund CPZ surveys in Marlow and if necessary a CPZ scheme in the Section 106 agreement, the Council are concerned that there will be not to be an unacceptable effect on off-site on-street parking. But the appellant has failed to show that the proposed development can be accommodated in the surrounding road network without severe impacts. Whilst there's no dispute over the trip generation associated with the proposed development, there remains a dispute as to whether the assessment of the impacts of the development should be undertaken by reference to the unmanaged or managed trip rates. The Council's view is that the appellant's use of managed trip rates, which assume and rely on a 60% modal share for cars, is not a reasonable future scenario, as identified in paragraph 116 of the NPPF, particularly given the context of the site and the nature of the proposed use and its users. To the extent that the appellant relies on the support of national highways as set out in the statements of common ground between the appellant and its focus is the A404, and the modelling shows that there's an improvement in the queuing on the A404 slips in both the unmanaged and managed scenarios. The significance of the improvement is not sensitive, therefore, to the appellant's operational management plan and traffic plan, and therefore the fact that National Highways has not raised any concerns should have no bearing on the judgment whether, having regard to the highway network as a whole, including the A4155, there is a severe residual cumulative impact. The Council is firmly committed to the vision-led approach advocated by the NPPF, but the outcomes inherent in such an approach need to be achievable. The NPPF glossary definition for the vision-led approach confirms that any vision must set outcomes to achieve well-designed, sustainable and popular places. Any solutions must therefore deliver on the outcomes set out in the vision. A vision-led approach is not a licence to circumvent the need for a robust and realistic transport assessment. It's also not a licence to avoid making contingent provisions for improvements to highway accessibility should validation of the vision ultimately show these are necessary. And with regard to the vision-led approach, Mr. Dix relied in his proof of evidence on DFT Circular 1 of 22, which at paragraph 48 provides that where development has not been identified in an emerging development plan, developers should demonstrate that the development would be located in an area of high accessibility by sustainable transport modes. That is a high bar, which is common ground the appeal site does not currently meet. The appellant's vision, which appears to boil down to its proposed 60% car driver mode share and cap on maximum levels of peak period traffic, is completely reliant on it making the appeal scheme highly accessible by sustainable transport modes in order to ensure that the mode share is delivered. That has not been demonstrated through the appellant's evidence. The achievability of any vision must have regard not just to the site, but also to its relevant context, including here the A404 and the A4155. That context includes, as I say, the very significant barrier presented by the A404 between Marlow and the site for non-car modes, and a challenging environment for pedestrians and cyclists at the Westhorpe interchange. The Westhorpe interchange is described in the appellant's own walking, cycling and horse riding assessment report as unfavourable for pedestrians and likely unpleasant for cyclists, views which Mr. Dix did not dissent from. Active travel trips in the vicinity of the site are currently very low and would need to increase significantly, including at the interchange, for the appellant's proposed mode share to be realised. Even with the appellant's proposed changes to Westport interchange, the environment will remain noisy, dominated by high-speed traffic and quite enclosed. Walking distances from local facilities to various parts of the site indicate that from most facilities, walk time is over 20 minutes, regardless of where in the site the destination is, and in some cases considerably longer. The same applies to the walk time for Marlow railway station. The vision must also take into account the particular use to which a proposed development will be put, who will use it and how. In the present case, there is time sensitivity in arriving at the site, given the need for production staff, crew and creatives to arrive in accordance with the daily filming schedule. The specialist workforce may be travelling to a number of different film studios on different days in any given week, and some, for example camera crew, will be bringing equipment with them which will require them to drive to the site. As explained by Mr. Davis, film studios have more car parking than the typical industrial sites because the way the sector typically behaves is to drive. The appellant has not undertaken any analysis of the proportion of staff which will need to drive to the appeal site, but in the context of an industry with a driving culture, the alternative means of transport to the site will need to be exemplary and exceptional for the 60% target to work. None of the mode share examples relied on Mr. Dix's rebuttal proof show, as a matter of fact, that a 60% single occupancy vehicle target has been achieved at a film studios. The closest, at 67.5% at Elstree, that is census data, not Elstree studio specific data, is at the end of the High Street in the centre of Boreham Wood, 850 metres from Elstree and Boreham Wood stations, with southbound trains to London St Pancras every 10 minutes and regular northbound trains to St Albans, Luton and Bedford. It is not comparable to the appeal site in terms either of its current or future accessibility. Furthermore, in seeking to demonstrate the possible ways in which the 60% target could be achieved, no doubt realising the potential for any meaningful shift to walking and cycling is limited, Mr. Dix relied on an option which assumes a significant proportion of car sharing as opposed to active travel, an approach which is not consistent with the prioritisation of non-car modes in the NPPF, for example in paragraph 115. In this context, the measures relied on by the appellant to encourage active and sustainable travel are not of the exemplary and exceptional nature needed to encourage the significant and highly ambitious mode share. A new Volvo hook bridge is necessary to make the development acceptable to provide a second crossing point for cyclists and those with mobility impairments over the A404. As agreed by Mr. Dix, it must therefore be secured by way of a Grenping condition so that it's in place before the operational phase of the development commences. But the design of the new bridge, while DDA compliant, would extend the crossing distance by 200 metres on each side, and the setting of the bridge remains poorly overlooked and it will not be well lit, again reducing the perception of safety and attractiveness for potential users. Any bus service surveying the site in Marlow will need to use the A4155 and the interchange roundabout, which experience significant peak hour congestion, lessening the attractiveness of taking the bus. It's also not an option for those who have to travel to the site with heavy or bulky equipment. The design of the new cycling and walking facilities at the interchange failed to comply with best practice guidance in LTN 120. That includes the 5 guiding principles of coherence, directness, comfort, attractiveness and safety. And as their basic principles, cyclists should be separated from pedestrians with an overall minimum width of the cycleway and footway of 4.2 metres compared to the 3 metres proposed by the appellant. That width is important to ensure the attractiveness and perceived safety of the route and to avoid collisions with other users. Given the roundabout is a high-speed, intimidating environment, there is an even greater need for the routes across it for vulnerable users to be perceived to be safe. Whilst this guidance is not mandatory, where the objective and vision for the development proposals relies on optimising walking and cycling, the more that the design of the cycling and walking infrastructure reflects best practice, the more likely it is the vision will be achieved. The route here is convoluted and fragmented, requiring pedestrians and cyclists to stop and undertake 3 if not 4 crossings of major roads. It also does not align with desire lines to and from local facilities in Marlow, including the railway station. Turning then to the failure to demonstrate the absence of severe residual cumulative impacts on the road network. As to the highways modelling, the Council raised a number of concerns with the appellant's highways modelling in the officer's report to committee and in his statement of case. Without any prior notice to the Council, the appellant embarked upon further modelling in an attempt to show that its development can be accommodated on the road network without severe impacts. Essentially, the model was extended to include the Bodmore Lane pedestrian crossing with its proposed signalisation, but none of the junctions further to the west of that crossing. Whilst the appellant accepts the need for a balanced approach to the consideration of impacts, that does require us, as an essential first step, a full and proper understanding of both the impacts as well as the benefits. The revised model does not assess the implications of changing the crossing on conditions in the centre of Marlow, which the appellant acknowledges are a constraint. The appellant's own supplementary transport assessment identified that those junctions, which include the A415 Chapel Street, B482 Dean Street, A415 Marlow Road Junction, and the A4155 Marlow Road High Street and A415 West Street Mini Roundabout, can be impacted by queuing, which extends back from downstream junctions during peak hours, meaning that they do not always operate as standalone junctions. In surveys conducted in July 2023, there was continuous queuing in both peak hours of over 46 vehicles, around a 230-metre queue from the Chapel Street junction, whilst the model queue was just one vehicle. Notwithstanding the recognition of interactions between these junctions and the identification of significant observed queues, they have only been modelled as individual junctions, and those models have not been calibrated. Mr Dix accepted that there are junctions in Marlow Town Centre and the High Street area, including 2 mini roundabouts, where there will occasionally be longer queues than those represented in the model. That significantly undermines the reliability and usefulness of the model in judging the severity of any effects of additional traffic, as it does not give a full understanding of the interactions between the junctions. Extension of the new model towards Marlow Town Centre was also necessary in a context where the only changes in the new modelling were to introduce signalisation at the crossing at Bodmin Lane and the introduction of mover at the Westthorpe interchange, with the prior modelling having shown severe impacts in the do-nothing world, extensive queuing to the model extent. Even in the 2034 managed scenario, the previous model showed queuing all the way from within Marlow across the Westthorpe interchange on the A4155. The failure to model the interactions between the town centre junctions and those closer to the appeal site mean that it's not possible to understand what has happened to the previously modelled queuing and what the real-world effect of signal control at Bodmin Lane will be on those junctions. Overall, the proposed development would not achieve safe, secure and suitable high-quality access by all modes of travel for all people. The design of footway elements and the nature of the proposed use is such that for many users, active and sustainable modes of transport is not sufficiently attractive or practical to achieve the dramatic reduction in travel to the site by private car, which the appellant's managed scenario relies upon. It therefore fails to comply with paragraphs 110 and 115 of the framework. For this reason, and the failure to include junctions in the model which have interactions with other junctions known to be affected by the traffic from the proposed development in the morning peak, the appellant's evidence fails to show that development can be accommodated without severe residual cumulative impacts on the road network in breach of paragraph 116 of the NPPF. And then to turn to deal with the effect on the safety of highway users, dealing with the non-compliance of the eastern arm of the Westthorpe interchange with the MRB design standard. It's common ground that the proposed redesign of the eastern arm westbound approach to the Westthorpe interchange is not compliant with the relevant DMRB standards in relation to flexion and junction geometry. That arm of the junction is subject to the most significant design changes. Mr Dix accepted that physically and as a matter of land ownership, it would be possible to provide an entry radius which did comply. Whilst there is an existing departure from standards on this entry, there will be significant additional traffic on this arm of the roundabout, 487 vehicles in the PMP, which will be directly attributable to the proposed development and will potentially approach and travel through the roundabout at increased speeds as a result of the insufficient deflection which the redesign provides. DMRB CD 116 provides that entry path radius is the most important determinant of safety at roundabout because it governs the speed of vehicles through the junction and whether drivers are likely to give way to circulating vehicles. In the case of the redesigned junction here, the entry path radius is 169.6 metres compared to the required standard of 100 metres, a significant deviation. Whilst a high friction surface could be provided, that is not sufficient in itself to prevent incidents. The introduction of signals at Westthorpe interchange does not resolve the issue. Drivers will likely race to beat the new signals where they are green, and the A4155 westbound movement is the movement which is most likely to be held at a red junction when signalised in order to avoid queuing on the A404 slips. The failure to redesign this arm of the roundabout to accord with roadworthy standards causes an unnecessary increase in the risk of conflict between users of the roundabout, resulting in an unacceptable impact on highway safety in conflict with paragraph 116 of the NPPF. Turning to site layout and servicing. As to the proposed site layout, it's not safe and suitable for its intended purpose and will lead to increased chances of conflict between drivers, cyclists and pedestrians accessing and moving around the site, which could and should have been designed out. It's common ground that whether spaces in a development are publicly owned or not, or accessible to members of the public, they should be safe and designed to be safe. Safe operation is a necessary and integral part of the design of the scheme and also minimises the risk of accidents as a result of human error in the operation of premises. There is an even greater need to ensure a safe environment and perception of safety, where developers are seeking to encourage and optimise non-car modes, and there is an emphasis in the site layout on active streetscapes by contrast with other film studios. The design here leads to instances where vehicles will be required to reverse over extended distances, in some distances around a bend, or where movement by vulnerable road users are to be encouraged, having regard in particular to the ambitious mode shift targets. The reversing manoeuvre is the one which poses the greatest risk to other users of the space. On average, there are likely to be around 120 to 160 HGV movements per day, and the number of HGVs accessing the cul-de-sacs in the development will vary significantly depending on what is happening on the site on any given day, and depending on production requirements, could be focused on a particular access route to the studios. This element of the site design is unnecessarily detrimental to the safety and convenience of users of the site, and the appellant's proposed site management plan does not adequately mitigate for the poor highway design. And then, for those reasons, the proposed development is detrimental to highway safety and therefore contrary to the adopted policies, and Madam those set out in 131, and I won't read those, but I'll now hand over to Mr. Atkin-Writer to deal with main issue H.
And the effect of the proposal on the living conditions of existing residents. And the proposed development would have a significant negative impact on the amenity of residents of the 31 apartments at Westport House and 55 dwellings at Westport Park Homes, in terms of their outlook and the noise and disturbance associated with increased traffic movements, including delays and blockages impacting their ability to access their homes in conflict with policy DM35 of the local plan. The proposed development also fails to comply with the requirement in paragraph 189 NPPF to ensure that new development is appropriate for its location, taking into account the potential sensitivity of the site. The existing residential community is particularly vulnerable as their sole access is proposed also to serve the studios. As evident, Madam, from the many written and oral submissions made to the inquiry by those living adjacent to the site, there is a significant degree of concern regarding the impact of the proposed development on their amenity. It would transform their outlook and experience from open rural fields with scattered hedgerows and trees to a dense grid of industrial, overbearing large-scale buildings in very close proximity. From those of the Westport Park Homes not immediately adjacent to the kitchen garden wall dividing them from the appeal site, it is currently possible to see over that wall and appreciate the open vista beyond. It would take 15 years for the trees planted as part of the proposed development to screen the buildings. The impact would be experienced from residential properties and gardens and on existing paths in the locality, which have considerable amenity value for residents, as well as on the access route. The character of the access road to the homes will be transformed from a lightly used rural access to a busy service road with 1,374 vehicles per day, resulting in queuing, congestion and delays in vehicle access and egress, causing inconvenience to local residents. From the perspective of residents, they will feel surrounded by the proposed development. With regard to noise and disturbance in particular, the policy context also includes the PPG on noise, which emphasises the subjective nature of noise and the fact that there is therefore no simple relationship between noise levels and the impact on those affected. Context is crucial, including how the noise from any new noise-making source relates to the existing sound environment, as well as whether noise is intermittent or continuous. The noise policy statement for England emphasises that there is no fixed amount for SOAL, which will be different for different noise sources, different receptors, and at different times. DMRB guidance on noise and vibration in the context of environmental assessment highlights the difference in experience of vehicles further away from a road where they will be perceived as a steady state noise from that road, and a more proximate noise in which the noise of individual vehicles can be distinguished and is therefore more intermittent in quality. While road noise from the A404 and A4155 is experienced in the vicinity of the site, it is relatively quiet in the immediate vicinity of the Westthorpe Park homes. The park homes in particular are individual prefabricated dwellings and lightweight structures with very small gardens and limited outdoor space, leading to a certain vulnerability associated with the physical nature of those homes. The people who live in the park homes are generally elderly and again may be considered vulnerable to a degree. They benefit greatly from the open environment around them, including the public right-of-way which crosses the site, which will also be influenced by noise from the internal access roads. Given the existing conditions of the site and the current experience of local residents, and the scale of activity associated with the proposed development, the introduction of a new noise source within 50 metres of homes will have a significant impact on residents. There will be an increase of between 5 and 10 decibels along the access road to the southern car park. At times, when there is a greater concentration of traffic, including HGVs, this noise will, in the council's view, cross into the SOAL category, bearing in mind that an increase in 10 decibels involves a doubling of loudness. The inability to predict the noise and its intermittency, which will include door slamming, beeping and revving, as well as the fact that it is unwanted, will increase the psychological impact of those living adjacent to the site. The noise would be in the near field, more readily noticeable, and therefore of a greater impact than the current road noise. The noise experience would be materially different to the current hum and background of road noise, which is constant and reasonably distant. Traffic noise from the proposed development will be more intermittent and closer. As Mr. Smith acknowledged in the landscape context, noise is an element of disturbance, and that element of disturbance will be brought much closer to the residents. The size of the site means that current traffic movements in the vicinity of Westthorpe House and Westthorpe Park homes are relatively infrequent, particularly by comparison with the number of traffic movements which would occur in close proximity to the site were the proposed development implemented. As Councillor Crabtree recognised, while the appellant's modelling shows an overall reduction in average noise, this to some extent masks the fact that there would be a reduction in steady state noise, but an increase in the intermittent, more disturbing noise. Mr. Van, there would also be some vehicle movement going into the evening. At this time, the perceived impact will be more significant. Background noise is lower. Mr. Sensical accepted there would be a significant change to the setting of the residential properties, and that the residential experience would be very different to what it is now. In that context, it is unreasonable for the appellant to ascribe no weight at all to the change in residence amenity. It is a harmful effect that must be weighed in the planning balance. I'll turn now to Mr. Bird to deal with scheme benefits.
As recorded in the planning statement from ground, the council accepts that there are a number of benefits which weigh in favour of the grant of planning permission for the appeal proposals, including economic benefits, social benefits and the biodiversity net gain offer. As explained in relation to main issues A and C above, the appellant has failed to demonstrate a need for the proposed development or that it cannot be accommodated elsewhere on a different non-greenbelt site. The need evidence relied upon by it, especially in the light of the most recent BFI inward investment figures, demonstrates the existing supply and pipeline is more than sufficient to serve the current needs and forecast growth. It's therefore legitimate to give no weight to need. As to the lack of alternative sites, as rightly recognised by Mr. Sensical, this is not a separate benefit. Even the appellant had demonstrated that it carried out a sufficiently rigorous ASA, it should not attract weight as a separate benefit to need or economic growth. In the Greenbelt context, because any inappropriate development in the Greenbelt has to be justified, failure to carry out an adequate ASA bears on the ability to demonstrate the very special circumstances required. However, as the contribution of the proposed development to the film and TV industry is particularly significant and recognise the importance placed on the growth of the sector, economic growth as a benefit is afforded significant weight in the planning balance, and that reflects the council's recognition of the focus the government places on the film industry and gives due weight to the importance of the sector and the potential benefit studios could bring. In terms of the other benefits, public open space is given moderate weight in the planning balance. There will be public access to 2.8 hectares of open space on plot 4, and the lakeside path will be enhanced, and the weight to be given to this benefit is moderated by the fact there's already a permissive lakeside path and that the public access facilitated by an improved path will provide some mitigation for the loss of and impact on other land within the RUR4 policy area. Upgrades to the public rights-of-way and off-site footpaths and cycle paths, including via the Westport interchange, are given moderate weight in the planning balance. Whilst they have some wider public benefit, they require mitigation and are substandard in the sense of failing to comply with best practice guidance in LTN 120. Including with this is the proposed Volvo footbridge, which is necessary to make the development acceptable in highway terms and would increase the crossing distance from 70 metres to 400 metres. And even with the proposed enhancements, it's not overlooked, screened by vegetation and any benefits from limited lighting. It also includes the enhancement of existing public rights-of-way that cross the site through the improved surfacing and lighting, which would have an urbanising effect on the existing character. The bus services are a required mitigation, but attract significant weight as a benefit, recognising their wider benefit to the public. And the Cultural Skills Academy, that's the built format, and recreational land and community building attract limited weight, as there's no evidence to demonstrate what specific need the provision of these facilities might address, nor any specific local community support for them. Biodiversity net gain of 20% attracts significant weight. Habitat improvements are not counted as a separate benefit, as that part of the BNG calculation. And the proposed tree canopy of 27% attracts neutral weight, as it's marginally higher than the policy requirement of 25%, and tree losses would occur as well at the new site access roundabout and on part of the frontage with the A415 Marlow Road, which will have a significant effect on views in and out of the site. There's no weight to be attributed to the SANG as a benefit, as the appellant is no longer offering or providing any. And on energy efficiency BREEAM, this attracts neutral weight as it's necessary mitigation for an impact on climate change of minor adverse significance that would otherwise be caused by the proposed development. Two other benefits previously relied upon by the appellant do not appear in Mr Sensible's proof of evidence. With regard to the proposed 60-40 mode share, it's agreed that this is not a benefit of the development, as it's a requirement of the proposed sustainable transport strategy to limit traffic impacts and achieve sustainable access. And it's also agreed that design quality is not a benefit given the significant harm to landscape character, visual amenity and residential amenity that will nonetheless be caused by this very large, dense and imposing development. Should there be any criticism of Mr Fannin in terms of his approach to the weighting of benefits and the use of a range within his banding, as suggested in cross-examination, it must be noted that Mr Sensible agreed that his weightings were also within a range. For example, the weight to be given to the economic benefits encompassed a very broad variation in employment figures and did not change following the correction by Mrs Evans to her evidence and her reliance on the lower end of her two ranges. Mr Sensible also confirmed that he did not give equal weight to each of the social and environmental benefits which are described in his proof of evidence as attracting significant weight. It was accepted that weighting necessarily is a matter of judgment influenced by a variety of factors, and there is no inconsistency between the weightings given in the table of Mr Fannin's planning rebuttal proof of evidence and indeed the planning statement of common ground. Turning finally, Madam, to the planning balance, for the reasons given above in relation to main issue A, the development is an appropriate development in the Greenbelt. As such, it's necessary to demonstrate that there are very special circumstances which show that potential harm to the Greenbelt by reason of inappropriateness and any other harm resulting from the proposal is clearly outweighed by other considerations. It's not a finely balanced decision. The benefits of the scheme set out above are not sufficient to outweigh all of the harms outlined in relation to each of the main issues above, other than main issue C, as well as the definitional harm to the Greenbelt. The benefits do not outweigh the considerable...
Sorry, Mr Bird, can I just make sure that everyone's got their microphones turned off? I can hear quite a bit of background noise coming from someone somewhere. Please, can you turn your mics off? Anyone that's not speaking. Thank you. Apart from Mr Bird.
His stomach grumbling, I suspect, Madam, but we're nearly there. It's only if the development is not inappropriate, the appellant's argument the development plan is out of date would have any material bearing in the planning balance. Even in that situation, it is flawed and should be rejected. The only policies which the appellant now claims are out of date are RUR4 and the alleged lack of support in the local plan for creative industries. As explained in relation to main issue B above, RU04 does not depend on the formal designation of the Little Marlow Lakes Country Park for its validity. Similarly, the planning policy environment in Buckinghamshire is already highly supportive of development to support the creative industries where it occurs in appropriate and sustainable locations, and is not inconsistent with the NPPF. The most important policies for the determination of the application we set out in paragraph 148. Madam, it's necessary to consider those policies together and reach a judgment as to whether this basket of most important policies is out of date as a whole. The fact that one or more policies might be out of date, which is disputed in any event, is not determinative of whether the basket of policies is out of date as a whole. In the present case, the most important policies taken as a whole are up to date as they're consistent with the NPPF and enable the Council's spatial strategy to be applied to economic development. In insisting the Council's local plan was out of date due to recent changes to the NPPF, the appellant has confused plan making and decision taking. The test of whether a policy is out of date for the purposes of decision taking is a substantive rather than procedural one, and involves consideration of the consistency of that policy with the extant NPPF. Therefore, the fact that a new local plan may not be in place for a number of years is irrelevant to the question of whether the most important policies for the determination of the application are out of date, and the reference to a lack of 5-year housing land supply is similarly irrelevant, as no residential development is proposed. So, Madam, in conclusion, for all these reasons and those given by the Council's witnesses in their written and oral evidence, you're invited to recommend that the appeal is dismissed. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you both for those closing submissions. Okay, I'm going to suggest we take lunch, as I presume everyone's getting a little bit peckish by now. Is 45 minutes long enough for everybody, or do you want to take an hour?
45 should be satisfactory, Mum. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, we'll come back at half. That's great, super. We'll come back at 2:30, and we are adjourned until then. Thank you.